Echoes, before birth, the children who spoke of their past life, before being born. Most children struggle to remember what happened yesterday. Ask them what they ate for breakfast, and they hesitate, eyes drifting toward the ceiling as if the answer might be written there. Ask them what they did last week, and they guess, piecing together fragments that may or may not be real. Their memories are fluid, unreliable, constructed more from suggestion than recall. This is normal. This is childhood. Memory, we are told, requires development. It requires language, context, narrative structure. Young children live almost entirely in the present moment, unburdened by history, unanchored by a cohesive sense of past and future. Their brains are still forming the neural pathways that will eventually allow them to hold yesterday, last month, last year in stable mental storage. But some children, quietly, unexpectedly, begin life already remembering something else. They speak of places they have never been, people they have never met, homes that do not belong to them, lives that ended before theirs began. And they speak not with wonder, not with the storytelling enthusiasm of a child inventing a game, but with certainty, with conviction, with the same matter-of-fact tone they might use to identify their favorite color or name their siblings. At first, their words are dismissed. Parents laugh it off. What an imagination, they say, smiling at relatives over the dinner table. She says she used to live in a big white house by the ocean. Isn't that sweet? Relatives call it creativity, the sign of a bright mind spinning tales. Doctors, if consulted, say it is fantasy, or attention-seeking behavior, or developmental confusion. A normal phase where reality and pretend blur together. After all, children are natural storytellers. They inhabit imaginary worlds with ease. They give life to dolls, stuffed animals, invisible friends. They blend what they see on screens with what they dream at night. But there is something different about these stories. They do not unfold like make-believe. Make-believe is expansive, ever-changing, collaborative. A child playing pretend will shift details, contradict themselves, accept new rules mid-game. They will be a princess one moment, a firefighter the next, adapting their narrative to whoever is playing along. These memories do not work that way. They arrive suddenly, often without prompting. They repeat themselves without variation, like a recording played back at random intervals. And they carry an emotional weight far too heavy for a child to invent. Fear, longing, grief, anger. Some children wake screaming, night after night, describing scenes no one ever told them about. Planes crashing, buildings burning, bodies falling. They cry out names their parents have never heard. They beg for people who do not exist, at least not in this life. Others speak casually, almost bored, as if recalling something obvious that adults should already know. They correct their parents on small details. No, that's not how you make it. My other mother did it this way. They point at old photographs and say, "That's the house I used to live in," even though the photo shows a place in a country they have never visited. They say things like, "That's not my real house." My other mother used to sing to me, "I died before. I don't belong here." And when asked how they know these things, they do not fumble for an answer. They do not look confused. They do not hesitate. I remember. The phenomenon appears around the same age, again and again, across cultures, continents, and belief systems, usually between 2 and 5 years old, before formal schooling begins, before history lessons are taught, before religious instruction has fully shaped their understanding of life and death, before they have learned what they are supposed to believe about existence. And then, almost always, the memories begin to fade. As language develops, the memories grow quieter. As identity anchors, I am this name, I live in this house, these are my parents. The other life recedes. As childhood tightens into a single coherent story, the fragments of another story fall away. By age 6 or 7, most children stop talking about it. By adolescence, nearly all conscious memory is gone. It is as if something is speaking early, before the architecture of this life solidifies, and then it goes quiet, buried beneath new experiences, new language, new identity. What remains in some cases is an inexplicable phobia, a deep, irrational fear of water, or fire, or heights, or enclosed spaces, fears with no origin story in this lifetime. What remains, in other cases, is a fascination, an unexplained obsession with a particular place, time period, or culture that the child has no logical reason to care about. What remains, sometimes, is a scar, emotional, psychological, a sense of displacement that never fully resolves. Or, in most cases, nothing remains at all. The child grows up, forgets entirely, and moves through life unaware that they once claimed to have lived before. One of the most unsettling modern cases begins in an ordinary American home in the late 1990s. A young boy, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, begins waking from violent nightmares. He screams, he thrashes, he cries out words his parents do not understand, fragmented, desperate, terrified. He says his plane is on fire. He says he cannot get out. He says the water is coming. His parents, like most parents, assume the nightmares are drawn from something external. Perhaps he saw an image on television. Perhaps he overheard a conversation. Perhaps a toy, a book, a passing comment planted a seed that grew into fear. But the nightmares do not fade. If anything, they intensify. The boy begins drawing pictures, obsessively, repeatedly, of planes crashing into the ocean. He uses crayons to sketch flames erupting from wings. He draws stick figures trapped inside cockpits. He draws water rising, swallowing metal and fire. When his parents ask why he draws these things, he does not say, I don't know, the way most children would. He says, because that's what happened. He insists the plane was shot. He insists the enemy was Japanese. He insists he was the pilot. Most strangely, he uses technical language, words no one taught him, words most adults could not define. He names the type of aircraft, a Corsair. He names the ship it launched from, the Natoma Bay. He names fellow pilots, men whose names mean nothing to his parents. When asked his name in the dreams, he answers calmly, without hesitation, James. James Houston. His parents are not believers in reincarnation. They are not spiritualists. They do not practice Buddhism, Hinduism, or any religion that teaches rebirth as doctrine. They are ordinary Americans, raised in a culture that views life as linear. You are born, you live, you die, and that is the end. They are not searching for meaning. They are not looking for answers in the supernatural. They are frightened because their son is describing something that feels too specific, too consistent, too detailed to be imagination. And so, reluctantly, not to prove anything, but to stop the fear, to understand, to help their child sleep, they begin checking records. They expect coincidence. They expect dead ends. They expect to find nothing and to be relieved. Instead, they find confirmation. There was a pilot named James Houston. He flew a Corsair. He launched from the USS Natoma Bay. He was shot down during World War II in the Pacific, his plane engulfed in flames before crashing into the ocean. The details line up with disturbing precision. And the boy is only 3 years old. Cases like this unsettle not because they prove reincarnation. They do not and cannot in any scientific sense, but because they challenge our most fundamental assumptions about memory itself. Where does memory live? We are taught that memory resides in the brain. It is encoded in neurons, stored in synaptic connections, retrieved through electrochemical signals. When the brain dies, memory dies with it. This is the materialist view, the scientific consensus, the foundation of modern neuroscience. If memory is only in the brain, it should die with the brain. And yet, these children remember things they never lived through, at least not in this life, not in this body. They remember events that occurred before they were born. They remember people they never met. They remember dying. How? The easy answer is that they do not actually remember. They are confabulating, constructing false memories from fragments of overheard stories, cultural narratives, media exposure. Children are suggestible. Their brains are pattern-matching machines, capable of weaving together unrelated details into coherent-seeming narratives. But this explanation falters under scrutiny. It falters when the cases occur in families with no prior belief in reincarnation, where the concept has never been discussed. It falters when details are verified only after the child speaks, with no possibility of prior exposure. It falters when the child resists the identity rather than embraces it, when they become upset, confused, frightened by the memories rather than delighted. Because many of these children do not want to remember. They cry when corrected. They become angry when told they are imagining things. They feel displaced, confused, as if the world has shifted them somewhere they did not choose to be. One child said it plainly, "I'm not supposed to be here yet." Another asked a question no parent expects. Why did I have to be born again? The memories do not feel like stories to them. They feel like facts. And facts do not care whether we believe them. Across India, similar stories have been told for generations. In a culture where reincarnation is not fringe belief, but foundational doctrine, where karma and rebirth are taught from childhood, these cases are more common, or at least more commonly reported. Children describe former homes in distant villages they have never visited. They name husbands, wives, siblings from a previous life. They point out possessions that were hidden or lost decades ago. They speak in dialects they were never taught, from regions their current family has no connection to. And when taken to these places, sometimes hundreds of miles away, many do something that no story, no imagination, no coincidence can easily explain. They recognize, not vaguely, not approximately, not in the way a child might point at any old house and say, "That one looks right." They walk directly to the correct house, as if guided by muscle memory. They know which door leads where. They identify people without being told who they are, without introductions, without prompting. Sometimes they say nothing at all until they see the right person, and then they run to them. Not like meeting a stranger, not with hesitation or confusion, but like coming home. In one documented case, a young girl in Sri Lanka refused to eat certain foods, insisting they made her sick. She had no allergies. Her parents could find no medical reason for her aversion, but she was adamant, consistent, unwavering. Years later, researchers investigating her claims discovered records showing that the person she claimed to have been in a previous life had died from an allergic reaction to that very food. In another case, a child in Lebanon panicked at the sight of water, screaming about drowning, refusing to go near rivers, lakes, even bathtubs. No one in the family had drowned. No one had told stories of drowning. The child had never had a traumatic experience with water in this lifetime, but the child insisted, with the kind of certainty that cannot be faked. I went into the water and didn't come back. Later, investigation revealed that the person the child claimed to remember had, in fact, drowned. These children do not speak poetically. They do not dramatize. They do not perform. They state facts, or what they believe to be facts, in the same tone they might use to describe what they had for lunch, sometimes with frustration, as if the adults around them are being deliberately obtuse, sometimes with sadness, as if mourning something lost, sometimes with an urgency that feels like unfinished business, like a message that must be delivered before the window closes. And perhaps that is the most haunting pattern of all. Many of these memories center on death, not peaceful death, not old age, not slow decline, sudden death, violent death, unresolved death, crashes, gunshots, fires, falls, drownings, accidents, murders. It is as if the final moment, the moment of greatest shock, greatest fear, greatest intensity, leaves the deepest imprint. As if consciousness, whatever it is, carries that moment forward more vividly than any other. In neurological terms, this almost makes sense. Traumatic memories are known to encode differently than ordinary memories. They bypass normal memory processing, embedding themselves in the brain with unusual clarity and persistence. Trauma creates what researchers call flashbulb memories, vivid, detailed, hard to forget. But that explanation only works if we assume these are the child's own traumatic memories, encoded in their own brain. What if they are not? What if the memory is coming from somewhere else? In some cultures, this is expected. In Tibetan Buddhism, the search for reincarnated lamas involves children who remember details of their predecessor's life, details used to verify the authenticity of the reincarnation. In Hinduism, stories of rebirth are woven into sacred texts, into folk wisdom, into the everyday understanding of existence. In these cultures, a child who speaks of a past life is not seen as unusual. They are seen as proof of what is already believed. But in the West, where such beliefs are marginal, where reincarnation is dismissed as superstition, these cases appear more disruptive. They are anomalies, outliers, things that should not happen if our models of consciousness, memory, and identity are correct. And yet, they happen. They happen in Christian families, Jewish families, secular families. They happen in cities, suburbs, rural areas. They happen to children who have no cultural framework for understanding what they are experiencing. And the pattern remains the same. Children remember briefly, and then they forget. By age 6 or 7, most children stop talking about their past life memories. Sometimes this is because the memories genuinely fade, dissolving into the background noise of new experiences, new learning, new identity formation. Sometimes it is because the child learns that talking about these things makes adults uncomfortable. They learn that their memories are not believed, not welcomed, not validated, and so they stop sharing them. One mother described it this way: he used to talk about it all the time, and then one day he just stopped. I asked him about it once, months later, and he looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about. It was like a door had closed. By adolescence, nearly all conscious memory is gone. What remains, in some cases, is a behavioral residue, phobias, fascinations, personality traits that seem disconnected from any clear origin. A child who once claimed to have died in a fire grows up terrified of flames. A child who once described being a soldier becomes obsessed with military history, even though no one in their family served. A child who once spoke of living in Japan feels an inexplicable pull toward Japanese culture, language, art, long after the memories themselves have vanished, or in most cases, nothing remains at all. The child grows up, forgets entirely, and moves through life unaware that they once claimed to have lived before. The parents may remember. They may keep the drawings, the recordings, the notes from that strange period when their toddler spoke of another life. But the child does not. It is as if a chapter was briefly opened and then closed, leaving no trace in conscious awareness. Skeptics argue coincidence. They argue that with billions of people on the planet, with countless historical deaths, with vast archives of recorded information, it is statistically inevitable that a child's random statements will occasionally align with a real person's life. They argue suggestion that parents, however unintentionally, feed information to the child, shaping their responses, interpreting ambiguous statements as specific claims. They argue cultural influence, that in societies where reincarnation is taught, children learn to frame their experiences in those terms, creating a self-fulfilling cycle of belief. These are reasonable arguments. They should be taken seriously, but they falter when examined closely. They falter when the cases occur in families and cultures where reincarnation is not taught, not discussed, not part of the conceptual landscape. They falter when details are verified only after the child speaks, when parents, skeptical and frightened, check records and find matches they did not expect and did not want. They falter when the child resists the identity rather than embraces it. When they cry, "I don't want to be this person," or "I want to go back to my real family." Because if this were fantasy, if this were attention seeking, the child would enjoy the game. They would lean into it. They would expand the story, embellish it, make it grander. But many of these children do not enjoy it. They are confused, frightened. They feel like they are in the wrong place, in the wrong body, in the wrong life. One child, confronted with the reality that the person she claimed to have been was dead, asked a question that haunts everyone who heard it. Then where am I supposed to go? The question is not whether these stories prove past lives. They do not. No amount of anecdotal evidence, no matter how compelling, can override the absence of a mechanism. We do not know how memory could transfer from one body to another. We do not know what would carry it. We do not know where it would be stored between lives. Science demands mechanism. It demands replicability. It demands controlled conditions. And these cases, by their nature, resist all three. But the question is more uncomfortable than proof or disproof. The question is, why do the same patterns appear again and again across time and geography? Why do the memories emerge early, in that narrow window between language acquisition and identity formation? Why do they fade so reliably, almost on schedule, as if governed by some developmental clock? Why do they so often involve death, and not just any death, but violent, sudden, unresolved death? Why do children speak before they are taught and fall silent once they are? And why, for a brief window at the beginning of life, does it seem as if something leaks through? Something older, something unfinished, something that remembers. There are no easy answers. The materialist explanation that these are confabulations, coincidences, culturally shaped narratives accounts for some cases, perhaps many cases, but struggles with the most rigorous, most carefully investigated examples. The reincarnation explanation that consciousness survives death and returns in a new body accounts for the specificity, the emotional weight, the verified details, but offers no mechanism and no way to test the claim. We are left in the uncomfortable space between certainty and dismissal. We are left with children who insist they remember, and adults who do not know what to do with that insistence. We are left with stories that should not exist if our models of memory and identity are correct. And yet they do exist, documented, recorded, investigated, and unresolved. Perhaps the truth is neither pure materialism nor pure mysticism. Perhaps memory is not as localized as we think. Perhaps identity is not as singular. Perhaps consciousness is not as confined to the brain as neuroscience assumes. Or perhaps these children are simply wrong, caught in a developmental stage where imagination and reality blur, where fragments of overheard stories coalesce into false certainty. We do not know. What we do know is this. Some children speak of lives before this one. They speak with conviction. They speak with detail. They speak before they should know how to lie. And they fall silent before they can fully explain. And for a brief, strange window at the beginning of life, it seems as if something remembers. Something that knows more than it should. Something that carries forward what should have been left behind. And then, almost always, it fades. The door closes, the child forgets, and life continues as if nothing strange ever happened at all. Let's explore more remarkable past life stories. Are they real or some strange, ultra-unreal coincidence? The boy who remembered the island where planes land on the beach. By the time most children reach age 6 or 7, the memories, if they ever spoke of them at all, have faded into silence. The door closes. The strange window at the beginning of life seals shut. Parents are left with recordings, drawings, notes from a period they can barely explain. But before that door closes, before the forgetting begins, some children speak with such clarity, such specific detail, that their words cannot be easily dismissed as fantasy or coincidence. They do not speak in generalities. They do not offer vague impressions. They describe concrete features of places they have never been, features so unusual, so specific, that stumbling upon them by accident would require implausible luck. One such child was a boy named Cameron Macaulay, and the detail he described, the one that cuts through every easy explanation, was something most people have never seen, never heard of, and would never think to invent. He described planes landing on a beach. Most people learn what an island is from a map, a shape outlined in blue, a dot of land surrounded by water, an abstraction, a concept, a geography lesson delivered in classrooms with pull-down charts and pointing fingers. A child learns it from a picture book, bright illustrations, palm trees, treasure chests, cartoon waves lapping at golden sand. Islands are places where pirates hide, where adventures happen, where stories unfold. But there are rare stories, quiet stories, unsettling stories, where a child speaks about an island as if it is not an idea, not a storybook location, but a home, a place they have been, a place they miss, a place they remember with a longing that does not belong to their current life. The case begins in Scotland in the early 2000s with a young boy named Cameron Macaulay. From an early age, before he could fully articulate complex thoughts, before he had been taught geography or history, Cameron started telling anyone who would listen that he had another life, another family, somewhere far away. He insisted the place was an island, not just any island, not a vague, imaginary place. He described it with a specificity that didn't sound like imagination. It sounded like memory, clear, persistent, emotionally weighted memory. His mother, Norma, tried to handle it the way most parents would when their child begins saying strange things. She listened. She reassured. She redirected. That's a nice story, Cameron. Now let's get ready for school. Children say strange things. Children invent worlds. Children play elaborate games of pretend that blur reality and fantasy. This is normal. This is development. This is what children do. But Cameron did not play with this story. He did not shift details. He did not change the narrative. He did not move on to new fantasies the way children typically do, cycling through dinosaurs and superheroes and astronauts with cheerful inconsistency. He repeated it. He returned to it. He lived in it. And the more he spoke, the clearer it became that this was not make-believe. Cameron spoke of a white house near the sea, not a general house, not a house somewhere. He was specific. One story, he said, a view of the water, details about the layout, the rooms, even details like the number of bathrooms, features that most children wouldn't fixate on unless they were recalling something real. He described the landscape around the house. He spoke of the beach, of the sound of waves, of the wind that came in from the ocean. He described the feel of it, not as someone imagining a postcard scene, but as someone who had lived there, who had walked that ground, who had belonged to that place. He described animals, a black and white dog, an orange cat, not fantastical creatures, not invented companions, real, specific animals that he remembered with affection. He spoke of playing outside, of picking apples from trees, of the feeling of sand and shoreline beneath his feet. He spoke of the quality of light, the color of the sky, the way the house felt inside. And he spoke of a family, not his current family, another family, a mother who was not Norma, a father whose name he knew. Shane Robertson, he said. That was the father's name in the other life. And the island, the place where all of this happened, was called Barra, the Isle of Barra, a remote island in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, windswept and edged by the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from where Cameron lived. He had never been there. His family had never been there. There was no obvious source for this information. No television program, no storybook, no overheard conversation that would have planted these details in his mind. And yet, he spoke of Barra with the certainty of someone who had lived there. But the detail that cuts through the fog of childhood fantasy, the detail that transforms this from a curious story into something genuinely unsettling, is the one that defies easy explanation. Cameron described planes landing on the beach, not flying over the beach, not near the beach, on the beach itself. If you have never heard of such a thing, that is because in most places it would be impossible. Airports are concrete and lights and control towers. Runways are asphalt and fencing and designated no-go zones. Planes land on carefully maintained surfaces designed for that exact purpose. The idea of a plane landing on a beach sounds absurd, dangerous, impractical, the kind of thing that might happen in an emergency or in a war zone, but not as routine, scheduled air service. And yet, on the Isle of Barra, remote, windswept, and edged by the Atlantic, scheduled flights can land on the hard sand at low tide. It is one of the only places in the world where this happens. The beach serves as the runway. When the tide is out, the sand is firm enough to support the weight of an aircraft. Flights are scheduled around tidal charts. Passengers arrive not at a traditional terminal, but at a small building near the shoreline. And when the plane comes in, it descends toward the ocean and touches down on sand, not pavement. It is unusual, remarkable, the kind of fact that delights travelers and aviation enthusiasts precisely because it is so rare. And it is not the kind of detail a young child in Scotland who has never been to Barra would casually invent. But Cameron described it. Again and again, he told his mother, and anyone who would listen, the planes land on the beach. At first, Norma didn't know what to make of it. She had never been to Barra. She didn't know about the beach runway. To her, it sounded like another piece of her son's elaborate, inexplicable story. But when researchers and documentary filmmakers became interested in Cameron's case, when they began investigating the details he was providing, they discovered that the beach runway was real. And when Cameron's family and investigators eventually traveled to Barra, their plane landed exactly as Cameron had described. He saw it. He watched the approach, the descent, the wheels touching sand, and he reacted not with surprise, not with the wonder of a child seeing something new and impossible. He reacted with the triumph of a child whose reality has finally been acknowledged. I told you it was true. That moment matters because it is not a vague match or a poetic resemblance. It is not the kind of detail that could be explained away as coincidence or cultural contamination or a lucky guess. It is a concrete, unusual feature of a specific place, one that Cameron had been describing long before he arrived, before he had any way of knowing it existed. Now, to be fair, verification is where these stories always become complicated. Researchers and writers connected to the case documented interviews with Cameron. They traveled with him and his family to Barra. They attempted to track down the family Cameron remembered, the Robertsons, the people he claimed to have lived with in that White House by the sea. And they found partial matches. Investigation revealed that a Robertson family did, in fact, vacation on Barra. They stayed in a house that matched key parts of Cameron's description, a white house, one story, with a view of the beach runway. When Cameron approached the house, he recognized it, not hesitantly, not vaguely. He identified it with confidence, as if he had been there before. Inside, the layout appeared familiar to him. He moved through the house not as a visitor exploring a new space, but as someone who knew where things were. He located bathrooms without being told. He commented on features that had changed since he last lived there, observations that suggested prior knowledge of the space. The emotional response was even more striking. Cameron did not react like a tourist visiting a place he had read about. He reacted like someone coming home. There was recognition. There was relief. There was a sense of finally being in the right place after a long absence. But the case also contains uncertainty that should not be brushed aside. Investigators could not conclusively validate every detail Cameron claimed. In particular, they struggled to corroborate the death narrative he described, the way he said he had died in that previous life. Cameron spoke of dying in a specific way. He described the circumstances, the feelings, the moment of transition. But local record searchers did not find evidence of a person dying in precisely the way Cameron remembered, at least not in a way that could be definitively linked to the identity he was claiming. That unresolved portion is important because it reminds us what these cases often are. They are not courtroom proof. They are not scientific validation. They are anomalous patterns, fragments of alignment that resist clean closure. They are puzzle pieces that fit in some places and not in others. They are stories that contain verifiable facts alongside unverifiable claims, creating a frustrating ambiguity that satisfies neither skeptics nor believers. But what cannot be easily dismissed is the emotional reality. Cameron was not telling a fun story. He was not playing a game. He was not seeking attention or inventing an elaborate fantasy to entertain adults. He missed the island. He missed the other mother, not as a joke, not as a passing whim. He grieved for her. He cried at school. He begged to be taken back to Bara. He became overwhelmed by a longing that his current family could not fulfill, no matter how much they loved him, no matter how much they tried to comfort him. In the documentary record, in the interviews filmed with Cameron and his family, you can see the weight of it. He does not perform. He does not exaggerate. He speaks plainly, matter-of-factly, about a place and a family that he insists are real. And when he talks about not being able to go back, he becomes visibly distressed. Not like a child disappointed that a trip has been cancelled. Like someone grieving a loss they cannot fully articulate. This emotional signature appears repeatedly in child past life cases. It is not the emotion of fantasy. Fantasy is joyful, expansive, playful. It does not produce grief. This is grief that doesn't belong to the present life. Longing that doesn't fit the circumstances. Homesickness for a place the child has never been, or at least should never have been. One researcher who worked with Cameron described it as watching a child carry a burden that made no sense in the context of his life. He had loving parents. He had a safe home. He had no trauma, no loss, no reason to feel displaced. And yet he did. He felt like he was in the wrong place, like he had been separated from something essential, like he was supposed to be somewhere else. When Cameron finally visited Bara, something shifted. The visit did not resolve everything. It did not answer all the questions. It did not provide the kind of definitive proof that would satisfy a scientific scrutiny. But it changed Cameron. He became subdued, quieter. The insistence softened, not because the story was disproven, not because he was told he was wrong, but because in a strange way, it was acknowledged. The place was real. The beach runway was real. The house was real. The island he had been describing existed exactly as he said it did. And somehow, seeing it, standing there, being in that place, it seemed to reduce the pressure in him, as if a loop had closed, as if something that needed to be remembered had been remembered and could now be released. After the trip, Cameron's fixation on Bara faded. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, over time, he stopped talking about it as much. The urgency diminished. The grief loosened its grip. He did not forget entirely. Years later, he could still recall the details, still describe the island, but it no longer dominated his life the way it had when he was younger. It was as if the visit gave him permission to move forward, to be fully in this life, rather than haunted by another one. If you step back from belief and disbelief, if you set aside the question of whether reincarnation is real or not, and you look at the human reality of this case, it forces a question that is hard to ignore. What happens when a child carries a memory that the adults around him cannot place? Whether you call it reincarnation, psychological imprinting, genetic memory, or something we do not have language for yet, the lived experience is the same. A child haunted by familiarity, a child remembering a home he cannot return to, a child feeling displaced in a life that should feel entirely his own. And in Cameron's case, there is a detail, the plane landing on the beach, that anchors the story to a real geography in a way that is difficult to dismiss casually. Because that detail is not common knowledge. It is not something you would stumble upon by accident. It is not a feature of islands in general, or beaches in general, or airports in general. It is specific to Bara, and Cameron described it before he ever went there. As the years pass, most children like Cameron begin to forget. The story fades, the intensity dissolves. The memories, if they ever were memories, recede into the background overtaken by the experiences of this life, this identity, this singular trajectory from birth to adulthood. But for a time, at the beginning of life, before school systems and social identity tighten into place, before the architecture of self solidifies, some children speak like travelers, not into fantasy, not into imagination, but back into memory. And when they do, they leave behind questions that adults tend to avoid, because the questions lead to uncomfortable places. What if the mind is not starting at zero? What if memory is not confined to this brain, this body, this life? What if consciousness carries something forward? Not everything, not perfectly, but fragments, echoes, traces of what came before. And what if the most honest witnesses are the ones we least expect? Because they are too young to understand the implications of what they're saying, too young to know what they're supposed to believe, too young to lie convincingly. Cameron Macaulay's case is not proof of reincarnation. It cannot be. No single case can prove something so vast, so paradigm shifting, so resistant to the methods of empirical science. But it is also not easily explained away. The skeptical responses, coincidence, suggestion, cultural contamination, struggle to account for the specificity of the beach runway detail, the emotional weight of Cameron's grief, the partial verification of the Robertson family and the White House. The believer's response that this is clear evidence of reincarnation struggles with the unverified portions, the gaps in the narrative, the absence of definitive proof that Cameron was, in fact, a specific person in a previous life. We are left once again in the uncomfortable middle ground, not convinced, not dismissive, uncertain, and perhaps that uncertainty is the most honest place to be. Because these cases do not provide answers, they provide patterns. Patterns of children speaking too early, with too much detail about places they should not know. Patterns of emotional resonance that exceeds what imagination should produce. Patterns of forgetting that follows a predictable timeline, as if governed by some developmental threshold. Patterns that repeat across cultures, across belief systems, across centuries, suggesting that whatever is happening, it is not new, and it is not isolated. Years after the documentary was filmed, after the media attention faded, Cameron grew up. He moved through school. He developed friendships. He built a life in Scotland with his family, in the present. The memories of Barra, if they were memories, no longer consumed him. He no longer cried for the other mother. He no longer begged to go back. But he also did not recant. He did not say, "I made it all up." He did not dismiss it as childhood fantasy. When asked about it later, he simply said that he remembered it, that it felt real, that he could still see the White House, still recall the beach, still picture the planes landing on the sand. But it no longer hurt. It was as if the memory had been integrated rather than erased, as if it had found a place in his life without overwhelming it. And perhaps that is the resolution these cases allow for. Not proof, not disprove, but acknowledgement, witnessing, a willingness to say, "I do not understand this, but I will not dismiss it." Because whether or not Cameron lived before, whether or not consciousness survives death, whether or not reincarnation is real, the fact remains that he experienced something. He felt something. He remembered something. He grieved for something. And that experience, that feeling, that grief, it was real to him. And in the end, perhaps that is what these stories ask of us. Not to believe, not to prove, but to listen, to witness, to allow for the possibility that the world is stranger, more mysterious, more layered than we have been taught to believe, and that sometimes a child knows something we do not. The plane lands on the beach. It is an unusual fact, a remarkable detail, the kind of thing that makes you smile when you learn about it. How wonderful, how strange, how perfectly unexpected. But for Cameron McCauley, it was not a fun fact. It was not trivia. It was home. And for a brief window at the beginning of his life, before the door closed, before the forgetting began, he remembered it. Not because someone told him, not because he saw it on television, not because he guessed, but because, in some way, we cannot fully explain, he had been there before, or at least, he believed he had. And his belief was so strong, so detailed, so emotionally resonant that it carried him across the distance, across the sea, across the years, across the boundary between one life and another, until finally he stood on that beach, and the planes landed just as he said they would. From the island to the stadium, the boy who said he was a New York Yankee, Cameron McCauley remembered a place, a white house, a beach, an island where planes landed on sand. His memories were rooted in geography, in landscape, in the physical world he claimed to have inhabited before, waves and wind and the sound of the Atlantic crashing against Scottish shores. But not all past life claims anchor themselves to locations. Sometimes they anchor themselves to identity, to a name, to a role, to a life lived in the public eye. When that happens, the questions become more complicated because memory is no longer private. It collides with history, with documentation, with photographs and statistics, and millions of people who remember the same life, but from the outside. In Cameron's case, investigators could travel to Barra and verify that the details matched. The beach runway existed, the White House could be found, the geography was real. But what happens when a child doesn't remember a place, but claims to remember being someone? Not just anyone, someone famous. Someone whose life is documented, whose death is recorded, whose legacy is enshrined in the collective memory of a nation. This is one of those cases. It begins not in Scotland, but in the United States, with a young boy named Christian Haupt. And unlike the island case, this story is not defined by longing for a home. It is defined by recognition, by the strange, unsettling insistence of a toddler who looked at black and white photographs of baseball legends and responded not with the curiosity of a child learning history, but with the emotional reactions of someone who claimed to have been there. The boy who refused to take off his uniform. Most 2-year-olds cycle through obsessions: dinosaurs, trucks, princesses, superheroes. The fascinations are intense but fleeting. A child might insist on wearing a cape for a week and then abandon it entirely for astronaut helmets or fairy wings. This is normal. This is how children explore identity, trying on roles the way adults might try on clothing, temporarily, experimentally, without commitment. But Christian Haupt's obsession was different. From the moment he could walk, he carried a small wooden baseball bat, not as a toy among many toys, not as one option in a rotation of interests, as an extension of himself. He talked about baseball constantly. He played baseball for hours on end, practicing swings, mimicking pitches, studying the mechanics of the game with a focus that seemed impossible for someone barely out of diapers. And most tellingly, most strangely, he refused to wear anything but a baseball uniform, every day, all day, even to bed. His mother, Kathy Bird, would lay out regular clothes, t-shirts, jeans, pajamas, and Christian would refuse them. He wanted his uniform, his cleats, the full regalia of a player ready to take the field. He slept in cleats. Think about that for a moment. 2 years old, sleeping in metal-spiked baseball shoes. For a parent, this behavior might initially seem cute, endearing, a phase that would pass, except it didn't pass. and it made no sense. Neither Kathy nor her husband Michael were baseball fans. Michael had grown up in Germany, where baseball isn't played. There were no games on television in their home, no jerseys hanging in closets, no family trips to stadiums, or conversations about players and statistics. The source of Christian's obsession was invisible, and yet the obsession consumed him. He was disinterested in toys, in television, in other children, in everything that typically captures the attention of toddlers navigating the world for the first time. He wanted only one thing: baseball. He sometimes referred to himself by a name that was not his own. Baseball, Conrad. Not Christian, someone else. And he spoke in ways that suggested he was not discovering baseball for the first time, but remembering it. I used to be a tall baseball player. The moment that shifts a story from unusual behavior to something we cannot explain is often a single sentence, a detail that doesn't belong, a statement that cuts through every reasonable explanation. For Kathy Bird, that moment came when Christian was still only 2 years old. He looked at her and said, matter-of-factly, the way a child might announce they are hungry or tired, "I used to be a tall baseball player." Not "I want to be." Not "I'm pretending to be." Used to be. Past tense. Kathy paused. She smiled, the way parents do when children say something odd but harmless. "Oh, really? That's nice, honey." But Christian wasn't playing. He repeated it. He elaborated. He spoke about baseball not as a game he was learning, but as a life he had lived. He described traveling to games by train, not by airplane, but by train, and staying in hotels every night. Details that, to Kathy, sounded like generic childhood fantasy, except they weren't generic. They were specific to an era, the 1920s and 1930s. Before commercial air travel became the norm, before stadiums had lights for night games, when professional baseball teams crisscrossed the country on trains, staying in hotels, playing only during the day because lighting technology had not yet been installed. Christian had no way of knowing this. He had never been taught baseball history. He had never watched documentaries. He was 2 years old. And yet, he spoke with the casual certainty of someone recounting their own life. Kathy began to feel uneasy. Not because she believed in reincarnation. She didn't. She was a devout Christian, raised with conventional religious beliefs that left no room for past lives or soul transmigration, but because something was clearly happening, and she couldn't explain it. The reaction to Babe Ruth, the moment that changed everything, happened during a family trip to a baseball stadium. Kathy and Michael, trying to nurture Christian's passion, even though they didn't share it, took him to a game. The stadium walls were decorated with large images of baseball legends, icons of the sport, frozen in black and white, larger than life. Most children would glance at the images and move on. Christian did not. He saw a photograph of Babe Ruth, the most famous baseball player in American history, a man whose name transcends the sport, a cultural icon recognized even by people who have never watched a game. And Christian became visibly upset, not confused, not curious, upset. He pointed at the image, his face twisted with an emotion that made no sense for a child his age. "I don't like him," Christian said, his voice sharp, with something that resembled genuine resentment. "He was mean to me." Kathy froze. Children don't form emotional relationships with historical figures. They don't carry grudges against black and white photographs. They don't look at images of people who died decades before they were born and speak as though they have personal grievances. And yet, Christian did. He reacted not as though he was seeing a stranger, but as though he were encountering someone he knew, someone who had wronged him. Later, when Kathy tried to probe gently, asking who the man in the photograph was, Christian's response was immediate. Dumb Babe Ruth. Not admiration, not curiosity, contempt. And alongside that contempt, there was something else. Affection for another player. When Kathy showed Christian a team photograph of the 1927 New York Yankees, one of the most famous teams in baseball history, known as Murderers Row, Christian studied the image carefully, and then he pointed. Not to Babe Ruth, to another player, a stocky man with prominent dimples. That's me, Christian said. Not, I like him. Not, he's my favorite. That's me. Kathy didn't know who the player was. She went home and searched online. 1927 Yankees dimples. The results led her to one man, Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse. Lou Gehrig is remembered for three things. First, his extraordinary talent. He played first base for the New York Yankees during the golden age of baseball, a quiet, disciplined player who stood in the shadow of Babe Ruth's larger-than-life persona, but whose skill was undeniable. He batted cleanup, fourth in the lineup, and earned the nickname the Iron Horse for his durability and consistency. He played 2,130 consecutive games, a record that stood for decades. Rain or shine, injury or illness, Gehrig showed up and played. This was not showmanship. It was discipline, work ethic, a quiet, grinding determination that defined his character. Second, his humility. In an era of showmanship and swagger, Gehrig was modest, hard-working, devoted to his craft. He didn't court attention. He didn't seek the spotlight. He simply played, day after day, game after game, with a relentless professionalism that earned respect even from those who found him boring compared to Ruth's charisma. He was the steady one, the reliable one, the player who did his job without drama or fanfare. Third, his tragic death. At age 36, Gehrig was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, a degenerative neurological disease that would later bear his name. On July 4th, 1939, he stood before a crowd at Yankee Stadium and delivered one of the most famous speeches in sports history. Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. 2 years later, he was dead. He died on June 2nd, 1941, at age 37, his body destroyed by the disease that had stolen his strength, his coordination, his ability to move. If reincarnation were possible, and this is still hypothesis, not conclusion, Lou Gehrig's life would fit the pattern researchers see in verified past life cases. A life ended suddenly, violently in a sense, not through external trauma, but through the internal collapse of the body itself. A life defined by unfinished business, by relationships fractured, by a legacy interrupted. And if memory carries emotion more than narrative, if trauma etches itself deeper than chronology, then Gehrig's death, slow, humiliating, public, would be the kind of ending that might leave a residue. The feud that lasted 7 years. But there is another layer to Lou Gehrig's story, one that makes Christian's emotional reaction to Babe Ruth even more striking. For years, Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth were best friends. This is documented, verified, part of the historical record. Ruth, raised in an orphanage, had never known a stable family. He was boisterous, reckless, larger than life, a man who lived without boundaries and paid the price in hangovers, scandals, and strained relationships. But in Christina Gehrig, Lou's mother, Ruth found something he had never had, a maternal figure. Christina welcomed Ruth into her home. She cooked for him. She scolded him when he drank too much. She offered him the kind of stability and warmth that he had been denied as a child. The Gehrig household became Ruth's refuge, and for years, Lou and Babe were inseparable. They played together, they traveled together, they won championships together. And then, in 1932, something shattered. The exact details are disputed by historians. Some accounts suggest it involved an incident where Babe made an inappropriate or disrespectful comment about Christina Gehrig. Others suggest it was a slow accumulation of resentments, jealousy over salaries, competition for attention, the clash of two very different personalities forced into proximity year after year. Whatever the cause, the friendship ended. Abruptly, completely. Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth stopped speaking. For 7 years, they played side by side as teammates on the most famous baseball roster in history. They shared a clubhouse. They traveled on the same trains. They stayed in the same hotels. They stood in the same dugout, game after game, championship after championship. And they did not speak. Not a word, not a glance. The silence was so complete, so absolute, that it became part of baseball lore. Even their teammates noticed. Even the press wrote about it. But neither man broke the silence. Until July 4th, 1939. The embrace. On that day, Lou Gehrig stood at home plate and announced his retirement from baseball. His body was failing. ALS had begun its relentless work, stealing his strength, his coordination, his future. The crowd wept. Players from both teams lined up to honor him, and Babe Ruth, who had not spoken to Lou Gehrig in 7 years, walked across the field and embraced him. The feud, whatever it had been, was over. In the face of death, the grudge dissolved, and for a brief moment, the two men who had defined an era of baseball stood together again, reconciled, forgiven. Gehrig died 2 years later. Ruth outlived him by 7 years, dying in 1948. But that moment, the embrace, the reconciliation, is part of the story, part of the unfinished business. And if Christian truly carried some fragment of Lou Gehrig's consciousness, if emotion persists when narrative fades, then the resentment toward Ruth would make sense. Not because Christian understood the history, but because the feeling lingered. The sense of betrayal, the wound of a friendship lost. Christian, at age 2, could not have known about the 7 years of silence. He could not have known about the complicated dynamic between Gehrig and Ruth. Best friends, then enemies, then reconciled only at the end. But when he saw Babe Ruth's photograph, he felt something. Anger, dislike, resentment. And when pressed, he said, "He was mean to me." Not, "he was mean," to me. As if the hurt was personal. As if the memory carried not just facts, but feelings. The details that didn't belong. As Kathy began researching Lou Gehrig, reluctantly, skeptically, but unable to ignore what Christian was saying, she discovered something that made her pause. Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth had been best friends. For years they were inseparable. Ruth, the orphan raised in institutions, found a surrogate mother in Gehrig's mother, Christina. The Gehrig household became a second home to Ruth, a place of warmth and stability that he had never known as a child. And then, in 1932, something happened. The friendship ended, abruptly, completely. For 7 years, Lou Gehrig and Babe Ruth, teammates, members of the same legendary roster, did not speak to each other. They played side by side, they traveled together, they won championships together, but they did not speak. The exact cause of the rift is debated by historians. Some accounts suggest it involved an incident between Ruth and Gehrig's mother. Others point to jealousy, competition, or a slow accumulation of slights that finally broke the bond. Whatever the cause, the silence persisted until July 4th, 1939, the day Gehrig announced his retirement due to ALS. On that day, in front of the crowd, Babe Ruth approached Lou Gehrig and embraced him. The feud, whatever it had been, was over. But Christian didn't know any of this. He didn't know about the friendship, or the falling out, or the reconciliation. He knew only that when he saw Babe Ruth's photograph, he felt anger, and when pressed for details, he said things that aligned, disturbingly, with the historical record. He mentioned a falling out. He mentioned Ruth being mean. He mentioned tensions that, to a 2-year-old with no knowledge of baseball history, should have been invisible. And then there were the other details. The trains, the hotels, the travel. Christian casually mentioned that when he was a baseball player, teams traveled by train, not airplane. Historically accurate for the 1920s and 1930s. He mentioned games being played during the day. Historically accurate, stadiums didn't have lights for night games until later. He mentioned fire in the lights at home. When Kathy questioned this, Christian explained, real fire, in the lights. He was describing gaslighting, a technology that had been phased out by the time Christian was born, but that would have been common in the early 1900s when Lou Gehrig was a child. One afternoon, Christian mentioned something else, something Kathy almost missed. He told his older sister Charlotte that when he was a tall baseball player, he hurt his knee and had to take time off. Kathy researched. Lou Gehrig had suffered a knee injury during his career. It had forced him to sit out games, a rarity for the Iron Horse, who was known for playing through pain and never missing a day. Christian should not have known this. There was no reason for him to invent it. And yet there it was, another detail, another fragment, another piece of a puzzle that didn't make sense unless you entertained the possibility that he was remembering something real. The photograph test. Kathy decided to test Christian's claims more rigorously. She showed him additional photographs of the 1927 Yankees. Are there other players who didn't like Babe Ruth? She asked. Each time, Christian pointed to the same player, the stocky man with dimples. Lou Gehrig? She showed him a photograph of two men standing together, arms around each other's shoulders. Who is this? Kathy asked, assuming it was a picture of Ruth and Gehrig during their friendship. Christian studied the image carefully. That's not Dom. Babe Ruth, he said. That's the coach. Kathy looked at the fine print beneath the photograph. Christian was right. The man standing next to Babe Ruth was not Lou Gehrig. It was Joe McCarthy, the Yankees manager. A 3-year-old should not know this. A 3-year-old should not be able to distinguish between players and coaches in black and white photographs from the 1920s. But Christian did, and that, perhaps more than anything else, is what pushed Kathy from skepticism towards something she could not name. Not belief, exactly. Not certainty, but an acknowledgement that something was happening and it was not normal. The physical resemblances. Kathy began to notice other things. Christian was left-handed. So was Lou Gehrig. Christian had prominent dimples, one on each cheek, with the left one distinctly deeper than the right. So did Lou Gehrig. When Kathy compared photographs of Christian's face to photographs of young Lou Gehrig, the resemblance was striking. Not identical, but enough to make her pause, enough to make her wonder. Reincarnation researchers often note physical similarities between children and their claimed past identities. The theory, speculative, unproven, but documented across hundreds of cases, is that soul or consciousness might carry some template, some blueprint that influences physical development in the new life. Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist who spent decades documenting reincarnation cases at the University of Virginia, noted that birthmarks and physical features sometimes correlated with wounds or distinguishing characteristics from the claimed previous life. In Christian's case, the dimples were particularly striking, not just their presence, but their asymmetry. The left dimple distinctly deeper, exactly as it had been in Gehrig's face. Or it could be coincidence. Millions of children are left-handed. Millions have dimples. But when those traits appear alongside behavioral obsessions, emotional reactions, and historical knowledge that shouldn't exist, the pattern becomes harder to dismiss as random chance. The prodigy on YouTube. Christian's talent, too, was undeniable. And it was this talent, not the past life claims, but the sheer, visible skill that first brought him to public attention. At age 2, Christian's mechanics were astonishing. He didn't throw like a toddler learning coordination. He threw like someone who had done this before, thousands of times, tens of thousands of times, until the motion became automatic. His batting stance was perfect. His follow-through, textbook. His focus during practice sessions, almost eerie in its intensity. Kathy would watch him in the backyard, swinging at pitched balls for hours, never tiring, never losing concentration. She thought, this is not normal. But she also thought, this is beautiful. In 2011, hoping to give Christian a moment of joy, Kathy recorded a video of him playing baseball and posted it on YouTube. The goal was modest. She wanted to enter him in a contest that would give him the privilege of throwing out the first pitch at a Los Angeles Dodgers game. She expected a few hundred views, maybe 1,000. The video went viral. Not hundreds of views, not thousands, 17 million. People shared it. Sports blogs picked it up. Coaches and scouts watched it with the kind of attention usually reserved for high school prospects, not toddlers. The comments ranged from awe to disbelief. How is this possible? No 2-year-old moves like that. This kid is going to the majors. Among those who watched was Adam Sandler, who was filming a comedy called That's My Boy and needed a young baseball player for a cameo scene. He reached out to Kathy. Christian, at age 2, appeared in a Hollywood film, cast not because of his past life claims, which were still private at that point, but because his skill was so visually compelling that it worked on camera. The role was small, a few seconds of screen time, but it marked a threshold. Christian was no longer just a child with an unusual obsession. He was a child whose talent had crossed into the realm of the extraordinary. The ceremonial pitch. In September 2012, Christian's dream came true. He was invited to throw the ceremonial first pitch before a game between the San Diego Padres and the Los Angeles Dodgers at Dodger Stadium. At age 3, he became the youngest person ever to do so. The moment was captured in a photograph that would later win Sports Photo of the Year. Christian stands on the mound, impossibly small against the vastness of the stadium. His left arm is cranked back, wound tight with the coiled energy of a professional pitcher. His gloved right hand points toward home plate, his body perfectly balanced, his face locked in fierce concentration. He is not playing. He is not pretending. He is pitching. And the form, the mechanics, the intensity, it doesn't belong to a 3-year-old. It belongs to someone who has done this 1,000 times before. The crowd cheered. Christian threw the pitch. It reached home plate. And for that brief, shining moment, he was exactly where he wanted to be. On a baseball field, in front of thousands of people, playing the game that consumed him. Coaches who worked with Christian in those early years describe a focus that seemed almost unnatural. He didn't play like a kid, one coach said. He practiced like a professional. He understood concepts, timing, patience, pitch selection that you usually don't see until Little League or even high school. Another coach described watching Christian study other players. He would watch older kids and absorb everything. He didn't just mimic, he understood. He'd ask questions about strategy, about positioning, about why a batter swung at a particular pitch. It was like talking to a teenager, not a toddler. Was it talent? Yes. Was it practice? Yes. But where did the drive come from? Where did the obsession originate? In a household where baseball was never discussed, never watched, never valued. Kathy and Michael didn't know. They could only watch, astonished, as their son pursued something that came from nowhere they could identify. And beneath it all, quietly, persistently, Christian kept saying things that didn't make sense. Things about being tall, about traveling on trains, about Ruth being mean. Things that sounded like memories. The struggle with belief. Kathy Bird did not want to believe in reincarnation. She was a Christian. She believed in heaven and hell, in linear time, in one life followed by eternal rest. Reincarnation contradicted everything she had been taught. She described the internal conflict in her memoir as feeling like she was cheating on Jesus. Every new detail Christian shared, every historical fact he shouldn't know, every emotional reaction he shouldn't have, pushed her further from the worldview she had built her life around. She consulted experts. She reached out to researchers who had documented cases of children with past life memories. Scholars like Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, who had continued the work of Ian Stevenson in investigating these phenomena. Tucker was intrigued, but cautious. He had published cases of American children claiming to remember past lives as prominent figures, actors, screenwriters, golfers, but he declined to formally publish Christian's case. Why? Because claims involving famous people are inherently suspect. They attract attention, they invite skepticism, they open the door to accusations of fraud, delusion, or parental projection. And unlike cases where a child remembers being an unknown person in a distant village, where verification can be objective, where details can be cross-checked against records that the family could not have accessed, claims involving celebrities exist in a world saturated with information. How do you prove a child didn't absorb knowledge unconsciously? How do you demonstrate that their statements aren't shaped, however subtly, by parental prompting or cultural osmosis? You can't. Not definitively. And so Christian's case sits in a strange limbo, compelling to those who hear the full story, but impossible to verify with the rigor that scientific investigation demands. Synchronicity and the journey. But something else began to happen as Kathy reluctantly accepted that she needed to investigate Christian's claims more deeply. A series of coincidences, synchronistic events that seemed almost orchestrated, as if the universe itself were offering validation. Or, depending on one's perspective, as if confirmation bias and selective attention were creating meaning where none existed. Kathy decided to take Christian to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, New York. She didn't announce it as a pilgrimage. She didn't frame it as a test. She simply thought, if he really remembers being Lou Gehrig, maybe being there will mean something. They walked through the exhibits. Christian moved through the halls with familiarity, pausing at certain displays, lingering over photographs, speaking with an ease that suggested he had been there before. When they reached Lou Gehrig's locker, preserved exactly as it had been during his playing days, Christian stood very still. "This was mine," he said quietly, not, "This is cool." Not, I wish this was mine. This was mine. Kathy felt her throat tighten. Later, back in California, she became obsessed with finding Lou Gehrig's childhood home. She didn't know why it mattered. She just felt pulled to see it, to stand where Gehrig had stood, to walk the streets he had walked. She researched. She reached out to historians. She dug through records. And she found it. A modest house in the Bronx, unremarkable on the outside, but marked by the fact that it had been Christina and Lou Gehrig's residence during Lou's childhood and early career. Kathy took Christian there. They stood on the sidewalk, looking at the building. Christian didn't react with wonder or surprise. He reacted with something quieter, recognition. I remember this place, he said. And Kathy, standing there with her son, felt the boundaries of her belief system beginning to crack. ALS Awareness Day. Perhaps the most striking synchronicity came during a baseball game Kathy and Christian attended in Tampa Bay. They had planned the trip weeks in advance, a simple outing to watch a game, nothing more. When they arrived at the stadium, Kathy noticed banners and signs everywhere. It was ALS Awareness Day, a day dedicated to raising money and awareness for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease. Kathy stopped walking. She had not known. She had not planned this. She had chosen the date randomly, weeks earlier, based on nothing more than schedule and convenience. And yet here they were, on a day specifically honoring the disease that had killed Lou Gehrig. During the game, the stadium showed a video tribute to Gehrig. His famous farewell speech played on the Jumbotron. Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. Christian watched, transfixed. Kathy watched her son, and she thought, this can't be random. Either it was the universe winking at her, offering confirmation, offering proof that she was on the right path, or it was the human mind doing what it does best, finding patterns, creating meaning, seeing significance in coincidence, because the alternative, that life is random, that our children's strange behaviors are meaningless, is too unsettling to accept. Kathy couldn't know which. She still doesn't. But she felt in that moment that something was being communicated. A message, a validation, a whisper from wherever Lou Gehrig's consciousness might reside, saying, yes, you see it, you understand. Or more skeptically, a mother's desperate need to make sense of her son's inexplicable claims, projecting meaning onto random chance. Both interpretations exist. Both are possible, and the case offers no way to distinguish between them. The memories fade. As with nearly all past life cases, Christian's explicit memories began to fade as he grew older. By age 6, the spontaneous statements had slowed. By age 8, he no longer insisted he was Lou Gehrig. He no longer woke up talking about trains and hotels and being tall. He no longer pointed at Babe Ruth's photograph and expressed anger. The door, as it always does, began to close. But the process was gradual, not sudden. Christian didn't wake up one day and forget everything. Rather, the memories softened, integrated, became part of his history rather than his present reality. When Kathy would ask him about the things he had said when he was younger, Christian would nod. I remember saying that, he would tell her. Not, I made it up. Not, I was confused. Not, I don't know why I said that. I remember saying it, a subtle but crucial distinction. He remembered having the memories, even if the memories themselves were no longer vivid, no longer pressing, no longer consuming. It's as if the past life, if that's what it was, had served its purpose. It had surfaced, been acknowledged, been witnessed, and then it could rest. Christian moved on. He developed other interests: basketball, video games, friendships that had nothing to do with baseball history or past life claims. The baseball uniform finally came off. He still played, excelling as a pitcher and shortstop, continuing to demonstrate the skill that had made him famous on YouTube. But it was no longer an obsession. It was a talent, a passion, a part of his life, but no longer the entirety of it. He became, in most respects, a normal kid. He attended Laguna Blanca School in Santa Barbara. The family had moved from Thousand Oaks. He played on competitive travel teams. He made friends. He listed contemporary players as his favorites: Clayton Kershaw, Corey Seager, Aaron Judge, Didi Gregorius. When asked about his favorite teams, he mentioned the Dodgers and Yankees. Both. The team he roots for now, and the team he claimed to have played for in another life. But he spoke of them the way any young fan might, with enthusiasm, with hope, with the present tense excitement of someone experiencing baseball for the first time. Not with the weight of memory, not with the ache of something lost, just joy. And perhaps that is the resolution these cases allow for. Not proof, not certainty, but integration. Christian carried something, whether it was memory or imagination, or something we don't yet have words for. And then he released it, or it released him, and he could move forward into his own life, unburdened by the past, free to be simply Christian. A talented young baseball player, a kid with dreams and friends and a future. Not Lou Gehrig's reincarnation, just himself, when Christian met Lou's family. But before the memories faded completely, something else happened, something that added another layer to the story. Kathy reached out to Lou Gehrig's remaining family members, not to prove anything, not to demand validation, simply to connect, to share Christian's story, to see if anything resonated. The response was mixed. Some family members were skeptical, some were open, some were moved. But one meeting stood out. An elderly relative, someone who had known Lou personally, who had memories of the man, not just the legend, agreed to meet with Christian. They sat together. Christian, still young enough that the memories were present, spoke about details of Lou's life that he should not have known. He described the layout of the house. He mentioned specific family members by name. He spoke about incidents, small moments, ordinary fragments of domestic life that would never have made it into biographies or documentaries. The relative listened. And when Christian finished, there was a long silence. "How do you know these things?" the relative finally asked. Christian looked up, confused by the question. "I just do," he said simply. The relative didn't say Christian was Lou Gehrig reincarnated, but they didn't dismiss it either. They simply acknowledged, "Some of what you said, you couldn't have learned that anywhere. Those are family stories, private things." And perhaps that is as close to verification as these cases ever come. Not scientific proof, not irrefutable evidence, but acknowledgement from someone who was there, who knew the life being described, that the details don't match what's publicly available, that the child knows something they shouldn't, and the only question remaining is, how? But Kathy couldn't forget. She couldn't unsee what she had witnessed, the intensity, the specificity, the inexplicable knowledge, and so she wrote it down. She enrolled in a writing class, drafted a memoir, and eventually published The Boy Who Knew Too Much through Hay House Publishing. The book describes Christian's claims in detail. It documents Kathy's own journey, from skepticism to investigation, to a reluctant acceptance that she could not fully explain what had happened. And it includes another layer, one that deepens the mystery even further. Kathy underwent past life regression therapy. In 3 separate sessions, she claimed to access memories of being Christina Gehrig, Lou Gehrig's mother. She described details of Christina's life that she later verified through research, details she insists she did not know beforehand. The bond between mother and son, she believes, carried across lifetimes. Skeptics, of course, have other explanations. They argue that regression therapy is unreliable, that it produces false memories shaped by suggestion and expectation. They argue that Kathy, having researched Lou Gehrig extensively for her son's case, could have unconsciously absorbed details about Christina and later remembered them under hypnosis. They argue that the entire narrative, compelling as it is, rests on subjective testimony, family belief, and patterns that could be explained by coincidence, cultural influence, or wishful thinking. And these arguments cannot be easily dismissed, but neither can the pattern itself. Because Christian's case is not unique, it sits within a larger body of reports, thousands of cases documented across cultures, across decades, across belief systems, where young children speak of past lives with details they should not know, and then fall silent as they grow older, when identity crosses lives. The difference between Cameron's case and Christian's case is the difference between geography and identity. Cameron remembered a place, a White House, a beach, an island he had never been to. His verification was external, objective. The planes landed on the beach, just as he said they would. Christian remembered being someone, a role, a name, a public figure whose life is documented, whose death is recorded, whose legacy exists independently of belief. But verification, in Christian's case, is slippery. Yes, he knew historical details. Yes, he expressed emotional reactions that aligned with the historical relationship between Gehrig and Ruth. Yes, his obsession with baseball seemed to come from nowhere, but none of this proves reincarnation. It suggests something unusual, something worth examining, but it does not prove. And perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the question is not, can we prove Christian was Lou Gehrig? Perhaps the question is, why do these patterns appear at all? Why do young children, across cultures, across belief systems, make identity claims that fade as they age? Why do they express emotions tied to relationships they should not know about? Why do they display talents and obsessions that have no clear origin in their current environment? If this were purely fantasy, we would expect variety, randomness, creative elaboration. But the pattern is remarkably consistent. The memories emerge early, between ages 2 and 5. They are specific, not vague. They are emotional, not intellectual. They involve relationships, traumas, or unfinished business. And they fade. Always, they fade. By adolescence, the children forget. Or they stop talking about it. Or they integrate the memories into their sense of self in a way that no longer feels like carrying someone else's life. Christian no longer says he is Lou Gehrig, but he remembers saying it, and that liminal space between memory and forgetting, between identity claimed and identity released, is where these cases live. Not in proof, not in certainty, but in the strange, unsettling acknowledgement that something happens, and we do not fully understand it. Emotion, not narrative. One theory offered by researchers is that if memory does carry across lives, if there is a mechanism we have not yet discovered, then what survives is not narrative, but emotion. Not the story of a life, but the feeling of it, the attachments, the conflicts, the unfinished business. Christian didn't recount statistics. He didn't describe games or victories or career highlights. He expressed emotion, dislike for Babe Ruth, affinity for the game, a sense of identity tied to a role that no longer existed. Lou Gehrig's life ended abruptly, not through an accident or a moment of violence, but through the slow disintegration of his body, a disease that stripped him of control, of dignity, of the physical strength that had defined him. If trauma etches itself deeper than ordinary memory, if emotional residue persists when narrative fades, then Gehrig's death would be the kind of ending that might leave a mark, a feeling of something lost, something taken too soon, something that carried forward wordlessly into the next life, manifesting not as conscious recollection, but as an obsession, a drive, a need to return to the field and play the game that had been stolen from him. But this is speculation, a hypothesis layered on a hypothesis, because we still do not know. We do not know if reincarnation is real. We do not know what mechanism could transfer a memory from one body to another. We do not know why children remember or why they forget. We know only that they speak, and then they fall silent. The message beyond proof. Kathy Bird says the message of Christian story is not about proving reincarnation. It is about love, about the possibility that the bonds we form, the connections that define us, are stronger than death, that a mother and son, separated by time, might find each other again, that the souls we love do not vanish into oblivion, but continue, somehow, somewhere, in forms we do not yet understand. And whether or not one believes in reincarnation, there is something deeply human in that hope, the hope that we are more than bodies, that we are more than this one brief span of years, that the love we give and receive echoes beyond the boundary of a single life. Christian story, like Cameron's, offers no definitive answers. It offers only a question, a possibility, a strange, unsettling suggestion that the universe might be stranger, more layered, more mysterious than we have been taught to believe. And sometimes, in that strangeness, a child knows something we do not. What comes next? In Cameron's case, the memory was a place. In Christian's case, the memory was a role. But in the next case, the one that follows this chapter, the memory is neither place nor identity. It is death itself. Not the slow fade of Lou Gehrig's illness, not the peaceful longing for an island home, but violent, sudden, terrifying death. The kind that burns itself into memory, if memory is what it is, with a clarity that defies forgetting. In the next chapter, we move from the baseball field to a burning building, from public legacy to private terror, from identity remembered to death remembered. And we ask the question that haunts every parent who hears their child describe the moment they died. How could they possibly know? From identity to death, the child who remembered dying in a Chicago fire. Christian Haupt remembered identity, a role, a name, a public figure whose life was documented in photographs and statistics, whose legacy lived in baseball history and collective memory. His memories were shaped by who he claimed to have been, a player on the field, a teammate in conflict, a man defined by discipline and humility, and a disease that stole everything. But there is another kind of memory that appears in these cases, one that is more difficult to listen to and far more difficult to dismiss, because some children do not remember who they were. They remember how they died. This is where the stories turn darker. Not dramatic in the way fiction is dramatic, not heightened, not stylized, not designed for effect, but quiet, precise, unsettling in their simplicity, These are not children recounting adventure or heroism. They are children describing the final moments of a life that ended in terror. And they speak about it the way they might describe what they had for breakfast, calmly, matter-of-factly, without the emotional weight that such memories should carry if they were truly their own. This chapter begins not with a researcher or an investigator or a belief system seeking validation. It begins in a normal home in Cincinnati, Ohio, with a small child saying something that doesn't belong in childhood conversation. The boy's name is Luke Rillman, and his story is one of the most unsettling in the entire collection of documented cases. Not because it is sensational, but because it is specific. The name that didn't belong. Luke was not raised in a household that discussed reincarnation. His parents, Erica and her husband, were not religious. They did not talk about God or heaven in front of their toddler. They did not read spiritual texts or attend services that might plant ideas about souls or past lives. There were no prompting questions, no leading conversations, no cultural framework that would make a child think about living before. What happened emerged gradually in ordinary moments, the way strange things often do in early childhood, not announced, not dramatic, but persistent. It started when Luke was 2 years old. He began naming things Pam, a ladybug, Pam, a toy, Pam, a drawing, Pam. At first, Erica thought it was just a word he liked, a sound that pleased him, the way children sometimes fixate on certain syllables. I specifically asked him, "Why did you name the ladybug Pam?" Erica recalled. He said, "I just think it's a nice name." It seemed harmless. Except the name didn't drift in and out of play, the way most childhood fixations do. It stayed, and then it expanded. Luke started making comments that didn't fit. When I was a girl, I had black hair. I used to have earrings like that when I was a girl. Not, I wish I had earrings. Not, can I wear earrings? Used to have, past tense. Memory, not imagination. Erica began to feel uneasy. This was not typical pretend play. Children invent characters all the time, but they usually frame them as pretend. Let's say I'm a princess. Pretend I'm a dinosaur. Luke was not pretending. He was describing. And there was something else unusual about him. Something Erica had noticed from the beginning, but hadn't connected to the Pam statements. Luke was obsessed with safety. At age 2, an age when most children are fearless, reckless, drawn to danger like magnets, Luke was careful. He worried about drinks that were too hot or too cold. He was cautious crossing streets. He took home safety seriously, in a way that seemed almost adult. His parents remarked on it. It seemed advanced, mature. It seemed like the behavior of someone who had already learned, the hard way, what happens when you're not careful. The question that changed everything. One day, Erica decided to ask directly. No more dancing around the subject. No more dismissing the comments as quirks. "Who is Pam?" Luke looked at her, and he answered with a clarity that stopped her breath. "I was." Not, "Pam is my friend." Not, "Pam is someone I made up." "I was." Erica pressed. "What do you mean you were?" Luke's response was calm, certain. "Well, I used to be, but I died and I went up to heaven. I saw God, and then eventually, God pushed me back down. When I woke up, I was a baby, and you named me Luke." Erica sat very still. She and her husband had never discussed God with Luke. They weren't religious. They hadn't talked about heaven, or death, or what happens after we die. Where had this come from? She called her mother, Lisa Trump, confused and unsettled. Lisa remembered something, a book she had read back in the 1970s by Dr. Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who had spent decades clinically studying children's past life claims. We started to realize, Lisa said later, perhaps we did have something there. But if they did have something, it came with a terrifying twist. Because Erica wasn't finished asking questions. The fire. Do you remember how you died? Erica asked the question carefully, not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Luke looked right at her. Yeah, it was fire. And then he did something that made Erica's blood run cold. He made a motion with his hand and body. A falling motion, like someone jumping from a height. Later, he would explain it more fully. He said Pam lived in a tall building in a big city. He said she walked a lot and took the train. He said there was a fire, and when the fire came, she jumped. These are not details children invent casually. Children invent magic. They invent flying. They invent superheroes who rescue people from fires. Luke invented commuting and death by fire, and the specific visceral motion of someone choosing to jump from a burning building because the alternative, staying inside, was worse. The trigger. There was one more detail that deepened the case. One day, Luke and Erica were watching television together. An explosion came on the screen. A building engulfed in flames, smoke billowing from windows. Luke became visibly upset, not scared in the way children get scared by loud noises or sudden images. Upset, distressed, as if he were watching something he recognized. Turn it off, he said urgently. Turn it off. Erica turned off the TV, and Luke, still agitated, told her why it bothered him. When I was a woman, I jumped out of the building because of the fire. He didn't say, I'm scared of fire. He said, when I was a woman. As if the memory was not hypothetical, as if it was something that had happened to him. The surge. Erica didn't know what to do with this information. Part of her wanted to dismiss it. Children say strange things. Children have vivid imaginations. Children pick up fragments from television, from conversations they overhear, from stories told by other kids. But another part of her couldn't let it go. The details were too specific. Luke had said Pam lived in a big city where she walked a lot and took the train. He had said she died in a fire in a tall building. He had said she jumped. Erica sat down at her computer and searched. Fires in Chicago. Chicago, because Luke had mentioned trains and walking, urban details that fit a major city, and because something about the description felt Midwestern, industrial, dense. What she found horrified her. In March 1993, 17 years before Luke was born, a massive fire had broken out at the Paxton Hotel in Chicago. The hotel, located at 1432 North LaSalle Street, was a single-room occupancy building in a predominantly black neighborhood on the near north side. At approximately 4 a.m. on March 16, 1993, a faulty space heater set a first-floor room ablaze. The fire spread quickly, whipped by 20-mile-per-hour winds, racing up stairwells, filling hallways with smoke. Before firefighters could set up ladders, terrified residents were shimmying down bedsheets or jumping from windows 2 to 4 stories above the rain-slicked street. 19 people died. Among them was a woman in her 30s. Her name was Pamela Robinson, and according to the reports, she had jumped from an upper-floor window to escape the flames. She did not survive the fall. The alignment. Erica stared at the screen. The name, Pam. The city, Chicago. The fire, the Paxton Hotel, the death, jumping from a window. Every detail Luke had described, spontaneously, without prompting, aligned with the documented death of Pamela Robinson. But alignment is not proof. Names repeat. Tragedies happen. Children absorb more information than we realize. Erica knew this. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond coincidence was happening. She kept searching. She found more details about the fire, how the building had been up to code but lacked a sprinkler system, prompting then-Mayor Richard M. Daley to call for tighter safety measures in single-room occupancy hotels. She found descriptions of the neighborhood, urban, walkable, served by Chicago's elevated train system. She found photographs. And that's when she decided to test Luke, the photograph test. Without telling Luke her plan, Erica printed a series of images. One of them was a photograph of Pamela Robinson. The others were random women, different faces, different ages, different contexts. She laid them out on a piece of paper, mixed together. No labels, no explanation. "Can you find Pam?" she asked Luke. Luke studied the images. He was young, still only around 5 years old at this point. Young enough that if this were fantasy, if this were guessing, he should hesitate. He should pick randomly. He should be uncertain. But Luke was not uncertain. He pointed directly to Pamela Robinson's photograph. "I don't recognize anybody," he said, "but I remember when this one was taken." Erica felt her hands go cold. Not, "I think that's her." Not, "Maybe that one." "I remember when this one was taken," as if he had been there, as if the photograph was not of a stranger, but of himself. The television investigation. By this point, the story had attracted attention. The paranormal investigation show, The Ghost Inside My Child, on the Lifetime Movie Network, reached out to the Ruhlman family. The producers wanted to investigate Luke's claims. They wanted to film, and they wanted to conduct their own test. On camera, they showed Luke a full page of photographs. Black women in their 30s, similar in age and appearance to Pamela Robinson. One of the women was Pam. The rest were decoys. "Can you point to Pam?" they asked. Luke didn't hesitate. He chose the right photograph immediately. First try. No prompting, no hints. Just recognition. For Erica, this was the moment that shifted the case from unsettling to undeniable. Not because it proved reincarnation. It didn't. But because it demonstrated that whatever Luke was experiencing, it was not random. It was consistent. It was specific. And it pointed again and again to the same person. Pamela Robinson. The shared traits. Erica reached out to Pamela Robinson's family, not to prove anything, not to demand validation, simply to learn more, to see if there were any connections, any resonances, any details that might explain what her son was experiencing. The family declined to comment publicly, but they did share some information with Erica privately, and what they told her added another layer to the story. Pamela Robinson, they said, had loved Stevie Wonder. She listened to his music constantly. It was her favorite. She also played the keyboard, not professionally, but passionately. It was something she did for joy, for relaxation, for expression. Erica felt a chill. Luke's favorite toy as an infant had been a small toy piano. Before he could walk, before he could talk clearly, he had been drawn to it, pressing keys, making sounds, spending more time with it than any other toy. And as he grew older, he developed an unusual affinity for Stevie Wonder's music. Not contemporary children's music, not the songs his friends liked. Stevie Wonder, the era of Pam's adulthood. These are not definitive connections. They could be coincidences, but they fit the pattern seen in other cases: behavioral residue, interests that seem to carry forward, preferences that have no clear origin in the current life, but align perfectly with the claimed past identity. The detail about race. There is one more detail that makes Luke's case particularly striking. Luke is white. Pamela Robinson was black. This matters because it eliminates one of the most common skeptical explanations, that children are unconsciously mimicking or identifying with people who look like them. Luke did not see Pamela's photograph and recognized someone who resembled him physically. He recognized her despite the difference, and he stated it plainly, without hesitation, when his mother asked, "Luke, what color was Pam's skin?" Luke looked at her as if the answer was obvious. "Black." He said it the way you might say blue if asked about the color of the sky, not as something surprising or significant, just as fact. I was a black woman. In reincarnation research, this is not uncommon. Cases documented by Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker frequently involve children claiming to remember lives as different genders, different races, different social classes than their current incarnation. The claim, if these cases are genuine, is that consciousness, or soul, is not bound by the physical categories that define human identity. Luke's case suggests the same thing. Whatever he remembered or believed he remembered transcended the body he currently inhabited. He was not confused about his current identity. He knew he was Luke. He knew he was a boy. But he also knew, with the same certainty, that he used to be someone else, someone different, someone named Pam. The fading. As with nearly every documented past life case, Luke's memories did not persist indefinitely. After he told the full story, after he identified Pamela Robinson's photograph, after he described the fire and the jump and the death, something shifted. It was as if the telling itself served as a release. Erica described it this way. It was like he got it out. He was finished and had nothing more to say about it. By age 6, Luke no longer talked about Pam. The name stopped appearing in his play. The comments about being a girl, having black hair, wearing earrings, they ceased. Luke moved on. He developed friendships. He went to school. He played with toys and watched cartoons and did all the normal things children do. The memories, if they were memories, faded into the background. Or perhaps they integrated so fully into his sense of self that they no longer needed to be spoken. This pattern, emergence, expression, and then silence, is one of the most consistent features of childhood past life claims. It behaves like trauma that needs to be witnessed. It surfaces. It demands acknowledgement. And then, once acknowledged, it releases its hold. Why death? Why fire? One of the most uncomfortable patterns in reincarnation research is how often children remember violent or sudden death. Cameron Macaulay did not remember dying. He remembered missing his home. Christian Haupt did not remember dying. He remembered being someone. But Luke remembered the end, the fire, the choice, the jump, the fall. Why? If memory truly carries across lives, why would it carry the worst moments? One explanation offered by researchers is that trauma imprints more deeply than ordinary experience. In neuroscience, we know that traumatic memories encode differently. They bypass normal processing. They embed themselves with unusual clarity and persistence. If consciousness somehow survives death, and this remains hypothesis, not fact, then perhaps it carries forward what was most emotionally charged. Not the mundane details of daily life, but the moments of terror, of choice, of ending. Another possibility is that these memories surface because they are unresolved. Pam Robinson died suddenly, violently. She did not have time to prepare, to say goodbye, to make peace. If some part of her consciousness persisted, if it attached itself somehow to a new life, then perhaps the memory surfaced, not to prove reincarnation, but to complete something left unfinished, to be witnessed, to be acknowledged, to be released, the God detail. There is one aspect of Luke's story that deserves particular attention. When he described what happened after Pam died, he said something no child is usually taught to imagine. He said Pam went to heaven. He said she saw God. And then he said, God pushed her back down. When I woke up, I was a baby, and you named me Luke. This narrative, death, followed by an encounter with the divine, followed by a return, is not standard Christian teaching. Luke's parents were not religious. They did not discuss heaven or God with him. He should not have had language for this experience, and yet he did. And his description matches reports from other children in documented cases across different cultures and religions. Many children who claim past life memories describe an in-between state, a place of light, a presence, a sense of being sent back rather than choosing to return. Ian Stevenson documented this pattern in hundreds of cases. Jim Tucker continued the research, finding the same themes. The child does not say, I decided to be born again. They say, I was pushed, I was sent, I had to come back. As if reincarnation, if that's what it is not always voluntary. As if consciousness is directed, guided, moved through lives by forces larger than individual choice. Luke's statement fits this pattern perfectly. He did not describe reincarnation as a spiritual journey he chose. He described it as something that happened to him. God pushed him, and he became Luke, the silence of Pam's family. One final detail deserves mention. When Erica reached out to Pamela Robinson's family, they declined to comment publicly. We don't know why. Perhaps they found the story too painful, a reopening of grief that had finally begun to heal. Perhaps they were skeptical and wanted no part of what they saw as exploitation or delusion. Perhaps they believed it, but preferred to keep that belief private. We cannot know, but their silence does not invalidate the case. If anything, it adds a layer of respect, a recognition that whether or not Luke truly remembered being Pam, Pamela Robinson was a real person. She lived, she died, she mattered, and her death was not a story for entertainment. It was a tragedy. 19 people died in that fire. 19 lives ended in terror and smoke and flame. And one of them, according to a small boy in Cincinnati, somehow found her way back. What are we witnessing? The question is not whether Luke's story proves reincarnation. It does not. No single case, no matter how compelling, can override the absence of a known mechanism. We do not understand how memory could transfer from one body to another. We do not understand what would carry it or where it would be stored between lives. The question is simpler and more unsettling. Why do these stories exist at all? Why do young children, across cultures, across belief systems, across centuries, spontaneously describe lives they should not remember and deaths they should not know? Why do the details sometimes align with real people, real events, real tragedies? Why do the memories fade as the children grow older? And why do they behave so consistently, like unresolved trauma seeking release? We do not know. What we know is this. Luke Ruhlman did not invent a heroic story. He did not claim to have been famous or powerful or admired. He claimed to have been Pam, a woman who lived an ordinary life, who walked and took trains and listened to Stevie Wonder and played the keyboard, a woman who died in terror, in a fire that should never have happened, in a building that lacked the safety systems that might have saved her. And for a few brief years, a small boy in Ohio carried that memory. He spoke it. He expressed it. He identified the face of the woman he claimed to have been. And then, having told the story, he let her go. So far, the memories we have explored have lived primarily in words. Cameron described a place, a white house, an island, planes landing on sand. Christian identified a role, a baseball player, a teammate, a man in conflict with Babe Ruth. Luke remembered a death, a fire, a choice, a fall. But in all three cases, the memory existed in language, in stories told, images recognized, details spoken. The evidence was testimonial, subjective, impossible to verify beyond the consistency of the claims and the alignment with historical facts. But in some cases, memory does not fade cleanly into silence. It leaves a mark, a physical trace present at birth. Something carried not in the mind, but in the body itself. In the next chapter, we move from memory, spoken, to memory embodied. From words and recognition, to scars and birthmarks that seem to map, with disturbing precision, onto wounds from a life that ended before this one began. And we ask one of the most difficult questions in this entire subject. If experience ends with death, why do some children appear to be born already marked by it? Birthmarks, scars, and the body that remembers. Luke Ruhlman remembered death, not as abstract concept, not as distant fear, as experience, the fire, the choice, the fall. His memory lived in words, descriptions of a tall building, a city he'd never visited, a woman named Pam, in whose photograph he recognized without hesitation. And then, having spoken those memories, having identified the face and named the tragedy, the memories faded. Luke moved on. The door closed. The story ended where these stories always end, in silence, in integration, in the mysterious dissolution that marks every documented case of childhood past life claims. But in all the cases we've explored so far, Cameron, Christian, Luke, the evidence, if we can call it evidence, lived entirely in language. A child described a place he had never seen. A child claimed a name he had never learned. A child spoke of a death he had never been told about. Words, recognition, testimony, subjective. Impossible to verify beyond the alignment of claims with historical fact. Because birthmarks are not words. A birthmark does not come from a bedtime story. A congenital scar does not come from suggestion. A physical anomaly is not easily explained as imagination or cultural contamination. So when past life cases include a physical mark, a scar, a deformity, a discoloration, in the exact place a child claims they were mortally injured in another life, the conversation changes, not because it proves reincarnation, but because it forces a more disciplined question. If the mind can be argued away as suggestible, what do we do with the body? The pattern across cultures. Across cultures that accept reincarnation as doctrine, Hinduism, Buddhism, Druzism, certain indigenous traditions, there is a long-standing belief that traumatic death can leave a trace, an imprint, a mark carried forward from one life to the next, etched into the flesh of a body that did not exist when the wound was inflicted. In Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, and parts of the Middle East, families who believe in rebirth examine newborns carefully. They look for birthmarks, and when they find them, particularly unusual ones, linear scars, discolorations in unlikely places. They watch the child. They wait. And when the child begins to speak, if the child speaks of another life, the family does not dismiss it. They listen. They ask questions. They test. In many reported cases, the child's story and the child's mark align. Sometimes it's a small round mark on the chest, and the child claims to have been shot. Sometimes it's a linear scar on the neck, and the child claims to have been beheaded. Sometimes it's a large discoloration on the torso, and the child claims to have been stabbed or struck with a weapon. The pattern is disturbingly consistent. The cases rarely begin as philosophical claims about the nature of consciousness or the persistence of soul. They begin as a child pointing to their skin and saying something like, "That's where he shot me. That's where I got hit. That's why I died." Most Western adults, when confronted with that kind of statement, do what Western adults do. They correct, they redirect, they soothe. "No, sweetie, that's just a birthmark. You were born with it." And the child might insist, "I know, that's where I died before." In communities where reincarnation is treated as normal, the response is different. Instead of shutting the story down, elders sometimes take the child seriously. They ask for details, names, locations. They take the child to villages the child names, and in a small number of reported cases, documented by researchers, published in academic volumes, circulated in both scholarly and popular media, those tests are said to lead to outcomes that go beyond eerie coincidence. Ian Stevenson and the systematic study of marks. The most extensive documentation of birthmark cases comes from the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who devoted the second half of his career to investigating what he called cases of the reincarnation type. Stevenson was not a believer seeking validation. He was a scientist disturbed by a phenomenon he could not explain. Early in his investigations, traveling through India, Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Turkey, and eventually North America, Stevenson began noticing that many children who claimed past life memories had birthmarks, not just any birthmarks that, according to family testimony and the children's own claims, corresponded to fatal wounds on the person whose life the child remembered. This pattern appeared so frequently that Stevenson decided it deserved systematic study. Over the course of 30 years, he documented hundreds of such cases. In 1997, he published his findings in a massive, 2-volume work titled Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects. The volumes contain 225 cases from Asia, Africa, North America, and Europe. 75 of those cases involve birthmarks or birth defects affecting the head and neck, the most common sites for fatal injuries. The reports are extraordinarily detailed, averaging 9 pages per case, and include photographs of the children's birthmarks, autopsy reports of the deceased individuals, when available, witness testimony from family members on both sides, medical records documenting the wounds sustained by the deceased, illustrations of the weapons involved. Stevenson did not claim these cases proved reincarnation. He was careful, even cautious, in his language. "The evidence is not flawless," he wrote, "and it certainly does not compel such a belief, but it demands serious attention." What made Stevenson's work controversial was not his methodology, which was meticulous, but his willingness to publish findings that contradicted fundamental assumptions of modern biology. The idea that wounds on a deceased person could influence the embryo of a later born baby is, as Stevenson himself acknowledged, subversive to many assumptions. It suggests that memory, or something like memory, can be carried not just in the brain, but in the body. That physical form might be shaped by experiences that occurred before the body existed. That trauma leaves a mark deeper than psychology, deeper than neurology, a mark that, in rare cases, persists across the boundary of death. Examples from Stevenson's research. The cases documented in reincarnation and biology include children with malformed or missing fingers who said they recalled the lives of people who had lost fingers in accidents or violence. A boy with birthmarks resembling entry and exit wounds who said he recalled the life of someone who had been shot through the body. A child with a scar around her skull 3 centimeters wide who said she recalled the life of a man who had undergone skull surgery before death. A boy in Turkey with a severe facial deformity who claimed to remember being shot in the face with a shotgun and whose birthmark pattern matched the scatter pattern of shotgun pellets. In many of these cases, Stevenson was able to obtain autopsy reports, medical records, or witness testimony that appeared to support the existence of the injuries on the deceased person's body. The wounds matched, the locations aligned, the type of injury, gunshot, knife wound, blunt force trauma, corresponded to the nature of the birthmark. But correlation is not causation. And Stevenson knew this. Skeptics argued, reasonably, that if families with belief in reincarnation might unconsciously shape narratives to fit birthmarks. Children might absorb stories about deceased relatives and connect them to marks on their own bodies. Statistical probability alone would produce some matching cases, given the thousands of births and deaths occurring globally. These are valid objections. They should be taken seriously. But they do not explain all the cases. They do not explain cases where the child identifies a deceased person unknown to the family. They do not explain cases where the birthmark appears before the child speaks, and the child later describes a wound that matches the mark without prompting. They do not explain why the memories fade, even when the mark remains. And they do not explain the Druze boy, the case of the Druze boy in the Golan Heights. This case sits at the extreme end of the birthmark phenomenon. Not because it is the most thoroughly documented, it is not, but because it is the most dramatic, and because, if the accounts are accurate, it represents something beyond uncanny coincidence. It represents a child using past life memory, not just to identify a wound, but to solve a murder. The story is reported to have occurred in the Golan Heights, a region near the border between Syria and Israel, in a village of the Druze ethnic and religious group. The Druze are a small, close-knit community with beliefs rooted in Islamic mysticism, but distinct from mainstream Islam. Reincarnation is a fundamental tenet of their faith. They believe souls are eternal, always reborn as Druze, and that birthmarks are often remnants of death wounds from the previous life. When a Druze child is born with an unusual birthmark, the family pays attention. And when the child reaches age 3, the age when past life memories are believed to surface most clearly, the elders follow a specific custom. If the child claims to remember another life, they take the child to the village the child names. They test whether the child's recognition holds up in real geography among real people. This is what happened with the boy in the Golan Heights. The birthmark and the claim. The boy was born with a long red birthmark on his head, linear, distinct, unusual. According to Druze belief, such marks are not random. They carry meaning. When the boy was old enough to talk, he told his family something that stopped them cold. "I was killed with an axe," he said. "A blow to the head." He pointed to the birthmark. "That's where it happened." This was not a vague claim. It was specific, localized, connected to a physical feature he had been born with. The boy did not stop there. He said he remembered the village he had lived in. He said he remembered his name in that life. And most dramatically, most disturbingly, he said he remembered the name of the man who killed him. According to the published accounts, the elders decided to follow the traditional protocol. They would take the boy to the village he named and see if his memory held up. The journey to the village. The group, elders, family members, and the boy traveled to the village. According to the reports, the boy led them through the streets. He identified landmarks. He recognized buildings. He pointed out the house where he claimed to have lived. Locals were called, witnesses gathered, and when the boy gave his previous name, people began to murmur. A man by that name, they said, had gone missing several years earlier. The family had searched, the authorities had been notified, but no body had been found. No resolution had been reached. The man had simply vanished. Until a small child, born after the disappearance, claimed to be him. The confrontation. Then came the moment that defines this case. The boy was asked if he could identify his killer, and the boy named a man, a neighbor, someone still living in the village. The accused was brought forward. When the boy pointed to him and said, "That's the man who killed me," the man's reaction, according to multiple retellings of the story, was visceral. His face turned white, but he denied it. He refused to admit to anything. And the situation might have ended there, one person's word against another, accusation without proof. Except, the boy said something no one expected. "I can show you where the body is buried." The discovery. The group followed the boy to a location outside the village, a field, a pile of stones. The boy pointed. "Under there." They began to dig. And what they found, according to the published accounts, was a skeleton. The skeleton of an adult man, wearing the clothes of a farmer, and on the skull, clearly visible even after years in the ground, was a linear fracture. A split, consistent with an axe blow, in the same location as the boy's birthmark. They also found, buried nearby, an axe, the presumed murder weapon, the confession. When confronted with the discovery, the body, the wound, the weapon, the accused man reportedly confessed. According to the accounts, he admitted to the killing, a dispute, an argument, a moment of rage. He had struck his neighbor with an axe, killed him, and buried the body under stones in the field. And he had lived with that secret for years, until a 3-year-old boy, born long after the murder, led a group of elders directly to the grave. The story, as reported, ends there. The man was not turned over to police. Instead, according to some versions, Dr. Eli Lash, an Israeli physician who witnessed the events and served as a consultant on health services in the Gaza Strip, recommended a punishment. What that punishment was, the accounts do not specify. But the case became famous, not because it was scientifically verified in a Western sense. There are no public court records, no forensic reports available for independent review, but because it encapsulates the most extreme possibility of what birthmark cases might represent. Not just memory, not just trauma carried forward, but evidence, physical, actionable, real-world evidence that led to the discovery of a hidden crime. The documentation question. This case is widely circulated. It appears in Truthato's book, Children Who Have Lived Before, Reincarnation Today, published in 2000. It has been reported by media outlets including India Today, Deccan Chronicle, and numerous others. It is cited by reincarnation researchers, including Carol Bowman and those affiliated with the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. But from a rigorous documentation standpoint, the case exists primarily in secondary sources. Dr. Eli Lash, who reportedly witnessed the events, died in 2009. The names of the boy, the deceased man, and the killer were never publicly disclosed. There are no photographs of the birthmark, no autopsy reports available for independent verification, no court documents confirming the confession or the punishment. This does not mean the story is false. It means we must narrate it in the correct frame. As a reported case rooted in community practice and published accounts, compelling, widely circulated, internally consistent, but not the same as a case you can validate through public records in a few clicks. That distinction is important, not because it diminishes the story, but because it preserves credibility. We acknowledge what we know, and we acknowledge what we do not know. And what we know is that within Drew's culture, this case is treated as real. It follows established customs. It fits the pattern seen in other birthmark cases documented by Stevenson and his successors. And whether or not it proves reincarnation, it forces a question that cannot be easily dismissed. What do we do when a child's body appears to carry a map of a death that occurred before the child was born? What birthmark cases do to the mind? Birthmark cases accomplish three things, psychologically, for anyone who encounters them. First, they introduce the possibility of physical carryover. Not just mental memory, but somatic memory. The idea that the body itself might be shaped by experiences that predate its existence. This is, as Stevenson acknowledged, subversive to modern biology, but it is not unprecedented in human thought. Eastern philosophies have long held that karma can manifest physically, that the soul carries imprints that affect the form of the next body. Western medicine has begun to explore epigenetics, the idea that trauma can affect gene expression in ways that might be passed to offspring. Birthmark cases sit in the uncomfortable space between these frameworks. Not quite mystical, not quite scientific, something else. Second, they highlight the pattern we've seen in every case. Children remember endings. Cameron remembered a place. Christian remembered a role. Luke remembered a death. But in birthmark cases, the pattern intensifies. The children do not remember lives. They remember the final injury, the gunshot, the stabbing, the blow to the head. The mark corresponds not to childhood's scraped knees or minor accidents. It corresponds to the wound that killed them. Why? If memory truly carries across lives, if there is a mechanism we have not yet discovered, then perhaps trauma imprints more deeply than ordinary experience. Perhaps the last moments encode themselves with such intensity that they persist, not as narrative, as scar. Third, birthmark cases force the most uncomfortable question of all. If a birthmark can be linked, accurately or not, to a remembered injury, is memory something the brain produces or something the brain receives? Western science assumes memory is generated by neural activity, encoded in synapses, stored in tissue, destroyed when the brain dies. But if memory can be carried in a body that did not experience the event being remembered, then memory is not solely a product of the brain. It is something the brain accesses, something it translates, something that exists somehow, independently of the organ we assume creates it. This is not a claim. It is a question. And it is the question these cases refuse to let us ignore. The skeptical lens. Even believers acknowledge the fundamental challenge of birthmark cases. Humans are wired to find patterns. If you show people a mark and a story, many will connect them. This is not fraud. It is not even self-deception. It is how meaning-making works. We see faces in clouds, constellations and stars, causality and coincidence. So when a child has a birthmark and later hears a story about a deceased relative who was shot, might the child unconsciously connect the two? Might the family, eager to find evidence of rebirth, interpret the child's vague statements as specific memories? Might the correspondence be less exact than it appears, distorted by the passage of time and the desire for narrative coherence? Yes, all of this is possible, and skeptics are right to demand rigorous standards. But skeptics also have to answer something else. Why do these stories cluster so consistently around early childhood when identity is still forming? Why do so many children point to marks before adults assign meaning to them, saying, unprompted, "That's where I died," before anyone has told them a story to explain the mark? And why do the memories fade, even when the mark remains? If the child was simply internalizing adult narratives, we would expect the story to solidify over time, to be reinforced, elaborated, expanded. Instead, it dissolves. The child stops talking about it. The memory, if it was a memory, releases its hold, and what remains is only the mark. Physical, permanent, unexplained. Whether reincarnation is real or not, these stories behave like imprints. The body holds a feature. The mind, briefly, holds a narrative. And then the narrative dissolves, leaving only the feature behind. A birthmark that becomes a question mark, a physical reminder that we cannot neatly file away. In the Drews boys' case, if the accounts are accurate, the imprint led to a grave. In Stevenson's documented cases, the imprints led to medical records, autopsy reports, witness testimony that appeared to corroborate the children's claims. In countless undocumented cases around the world, the imprints led nowhere. Just families trying to make sense of something strange their child said, before the child forgot and moved on. But the pattern remains, and the pattern raises a possibility that science has not yet addressed, that the body is not merely the container for experience, that it is, in some way we do not yet understand, the recorder of it, and that in rare cases, in that narrow window between birth and age 7, when the door between lives seems briefly open, the recording becomes audible. The child speaks, the mark is revealed, and for a moment, we are forced to confront the possibility that who we are is not limited to who we have been in this life, the transition to what comes next. We have now seen the pattern from multiple angles. Cameron described a place. Christian claimed a name. Luke remembered a death. And in birthmark cases, the memory becomes physical, etched into skin, visible at birth, corresponding to wounds that predate the body that bears them. But in all these cases, one fact remains constant. The memories fade. Always, they fade. Cameron stopped crying for Bara after he visited it. Christian stopped insisting he was Lou Gehrig as his own sense of self solidified. Luke stopped talking about Pam after he told her story, and children with birthmarks who claim past life memories eventually fall silent about those memories, even though the marks remain. This fading is not a minor detail. It is the most repeated fact across thousands of documented cases. And if there is anything close to a law in this phenomenon, it is this. Children remember early, and then they forget. So in the next chapter, we ask the unavoidable question, if these memories are real, why do they disappear? And if they are not real, why do they disappear in such consistent ways? Because the fading may be the most important clue of all. It may be the key to understanding not just whether reincarnation is possible, but what childhood actually is, and why the earliest years of life seem to exist in a different relationship to memory, to identity, to time itself. Chapter 6, expanded, and final. Why the memories fade, and what that might mean. Transition, the journey we've taken. We began this exploration with a simple question. What are we to make of children who speak of lives they should not remember? And over the course of these chapters, we have encountered pattern after pattern, story after story, each one unsettling in its own way. In Chapter 1, we explored the general phenomenon, how children across cultures and belief systems spontaneously describe places, people, and events from before they were born. We saw how these memories emerge early, peak between ages 2 and 5, and then fade, almost always by adolescence. In Chapter 2, we met Cameron Macaulay, the Scottish boy who longed for an island called Barra, a place he had never visited, where he claimed to have lived in a white house near a beach where planes landed on sand. When his mother finally took him there, the details aligned. The beach runway existed, the house could be found, and after the visit, his distress eased, as if acknowledgement itself was healing. In Chapter 3, we encountered Christian Haupt, the boy who refused to take off his baseball uniform, who slept in cleats at age 2, who looked at a photograph of Babe Ruth and said, "He was mean to me." Christian claimed to be Lou Gehrig, the Iron Horse, the humble first baseman whose life ended in tragedy from ALS. His knowledge of 1920s baseball history, his emotional reactions to figures he should never have heard of, his physical resemblance to Gehrig, all of it suggested something beyond ordinary childhood fantasy. In Chapter 4, the memories turned darker. Luke Ruhlman remembered death. Not abstractly, but specifically. He remembered being Pam, a black woman who died in a Chicago hotel fire in 1993, 17 years before he was born. He described the fire, the choice to jump, the fall, and when shown photographs, he identified Pamela Robinson without hesitation. "I remember when that picture was taken," he said, as if he had been there. In Chapter 5, the evidence moved from words to body. We explored birthmark cases, children born with scars, deformities, or marks in the exact locations where they claimed to have been fatally wounded in previous lives. We examined Ian Stevenson's 30 years of systematic documentation, 225 cases, photographs, autopsy reports, medical records, and we encountered the Drews boy in the Golan Heights, who not only remembered his murder, but led elders to his killer and to the grave where his body lay buried. 5 chapters, 5 different angles on the same mysterious phenomenon, and in every case, every single one, the pattern held. The memories faded. Always, they faded. Cameron stopped crying for Barra. Christian stopped insisting he was Lou Gehrig. Luke stopped talking about Pam. And children with birthmarks, even when the marks remained visible, eventually fell silent about the lives they claimed to remember. This brings us to the final question. Not are these memories real, but why do they fade? Because if this phenomenon were random, the fading would be random too. Instead, it follows a pattern so consistent that researchers, skeptics, and believers alike acknowledge it. The memories emerge early. They peak between ages 2 and 5. They weaken by age 6 or 7. And by adolescence, they are almost always gone. This happens across cultures, across belief systems, across continents, across thousands of documented cases spanning more than 60 years of research, which means forgetting is not an accident. It appears to be part of the process itself, the architecture of identity formation. To understand why these memories fade, we must first understand what is happening developmentally during the years when they appear. Early childhood, from birth to age 7, is not just a phase of growth. It is a phase of construction. A child is not born with a finished sense of self. That self is assembled slowly, painstakingly, through language acquisition, social relationships, feedback from caregivers, cultural learning, memory consolidation, narrative formation. Before that assembly is complete, identity is fluid. Psychologists studying childhood development describe this period as one of extraordinary plasticity. The brain is forming neural pathways, pruning unnecessary connections, organizing experience into coherent patterns. During this time, the child is learning fundamental questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? What is my story? And in that fluidity, something unusual seems to happen in certain children. They speak as if they are carrying more than one story, more than one beginning, as if the boundary between this life and something before is not yet fully sealed. But as identity solidifies, as the child learns their name, their family, their place in the world, the mind appears to make a choice. One story survives, the others dissolve. When school begins, the door closes. Research consistently shows that past life memories fade most dramatically around age 6 or 7, precisely when children enter formal schooling. This is not coincidental. School represents a massive shift in a child's life. It is the first time most children spend extended periods away from their primary caregivers. It is where they are taught, explicitly, who they are supposed to be, their legal name, their birth date, their family history, their nationality. It is where they learn to construct autobiographical narratives in a standardized way. I was born in year. I live in place. My parents are names. This process, developmental psychologists call it narrative identity formation, is essential for functioning in society, but it may also be incompatible with carrying memories from another life. Jim Tucker, the current director of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, has noted this pattern in thousands of cases. Most children stop talking about the purported life of the other individual by the age of 6 to 7 as they enter school, and tend to lose the memories of this experience as they get older. This fading occurs whether or not the child's claims were believed, whether or not they were investigated, whether or not they were validated. It happens regardless of external reinforcement, which suggests the fading is not about validation, it is about integration. The child is learning to inhabit this life fully, and to do that, they must let go of whatever came before. The paradox of closure. But here is where the pattern becomes even more intriguing. In multiple cases, closure seems to accelerate forgetting. Cameron Macaulay visited Barra, and his distress eased almost immediately. He stopped crying for his other mother. He stopped begging to go back. The longing that had consumed him for years simply released. Christian Haupt's mother described something similar. After Christian told the full story, after he identified Lou Gehrig's photograph, after he shared his memories of the feud with Babe Ruth, the intensity faded. He developed other interests. The obsession loosened its grip. Luke Relman's mother said it explicitly. It was like he got it out. He was finished and had nothing more to say about it. Expression led to release. This is not how fantasy usually behaves. Fantasy thrives on attention. It expands. It elaborates. It becomes more complex with time. But these memories seem to lose power, once acknowledged, once witnessed. As if the memory was not seeking validation, but simply seeking to be heard. The trauma processing model. This pattern has led some researchers to suggest that past life memories may function like trauma processing. Not trauma from this life, but unresolved emotional residue from something that came before. In modern psychology, we know that trauma does not heal through suppression. It heals through expression, acknowledgement, and integration. Therapies like EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing, and trauma-focused CBT work precisely because they allow the patient to revisit the traumatic memory in a safe context, express what happened, and then integrate it into their narrative without being consumed by it. What if that's what's happening with these children? What if the memories surface not to prove reincarnation, but to complete something left unfinished? Consider the pattern we've seen. 70% of children with past life memories recall dying by murder, suicide, or accident. More than 35% show intense fear related to the manner of death. Many exhibit phobias consistent with their claimed death: fear of water if they drowned, fear of fire if they burned. These fears often match the DSM criteria for PTSD: avoidant behavior, hypervigilance, intense distress. But here's what makes this different from ordinary childhood PTSD. The trauma did not happen to them in this life. There is no event in their current existence that would explain the fear, unless the memory is somehow carrying forward from before. Jim Tucker describes it this way: fragments of consciousness get transferred from one life to the next. Not a complete personality, but emotional residue, strong attachments, strong conflicts, unfinished business. If that is true, and it remains hypothesis, not fact, then the fading would make sense. The child speaks the memory. The adults listen. The memory is acknowledged, and then it can be released, not because it was validated as real, but because it was heard. The function of forgetting. But even if one rejects reincarnation entirely, the phenomenon still demands explanation. Why do children across the world independently produce narratives with the same structure? Why do they surface early and vanish predictably? Why do they carry emotional weight disproportionate to imagination? The answer may lie in recognizing that forgetting is not failure. Forgetting may be functional. Imagine what it would mean to grow up fully remembering another life, another family you loved and lost, another death you experienced, another identity that is no longer yours. Grief would compound, attachment would fracture, development would stall. You would be trapped between two lives, unable to fully inhabit either one. Forgetting, then, may be the mind's way of protecting continuity, of choosing this life over the memory of others, of allowing a child to become who they are meant to be in this incarnation, without being haunted by who they were before. If these memories are real, forgetting may be mercy. If they are psychological constructions, forgetting may be integration. Either way, forgetting serves survival. What remains? The follow-up studies. Interestingly, recent follow-up research complicates the narrative of total forgetting. Two major studies, one in Sri Lanka, one in Lebanon, tracked down adults who had been documented as children with past life memories and interviewed them decades later. The findings were surprising. In Sri Lanka, 38% of adults said they still retained some memories from what they had described as children. In Lebanon, among the Druze, 75% said they retained some memories, not the vivid, consuming memories of early childhood, but fragments, impressions, a sense that something had been there. When asked about the importance of these memories, 56% said the memories had been important during their childhood and development, but only 26% said they remained important in adulthood. Most described the experience as having faded into background, no longer driving their behavior, no longer shaping their identity, but not entirely gone either. like a photograph left too long in sunlight. The colors have faded, the edges have blurred, but the image is still there if you look closely. This suggests that the forgetting may not be erasure, it may be integration. The memory becomes part of the foundation of who they are, rather than something that stands apart from their current identity. The skeptical explanations and where they falter. Throughout this exploration, we have acknowledged skeptical explanations, and we must continue to do so here. Psychologists who reject reincarnation argue that children are especially sensitive to narrative formation during early childhood. The brain experiments with identity. Some children construct unusually vivid internal stories that feel real, and as cognition matures, the brain prunes those stories away, just as it prunes unnecessary neural connections. This explanation is not unreasonable. It aligns with what we know about brain development, imagination, and the malleability of memory, but it leaves several things unanswered. First, why do these stories follow similar themes? Death, identity, place, across cultures that do not share beliefs about reincarnation? A child in Thailand, a child in Virginia, a child in Lebanon, a child in Scotland, none of them taught to believe in past lives, independently produce narratives with the same structure. If this were purely imaginative, we would expect more variety. Second, why do children often resist the memories rather than enjoy them? Fantasy is pleasurable. Children lean into make-believe. They elaborate. They perform. But many of these children are distressed by what they remember. They cry. They beg to go home, to a place that isn't their current home. They express grief for families that aren't their current families. That is not how fantasy behaves. Third, why do the memories fade without reinforcement? If these were culturally constructed narratives, we would expect them to solidify over time, to be reinforced by community, family, and the child's own investment in the story. Instead, they dissolve. The child stops talking about it. The memory loses its grip. Life continues. And fourth, why does acknowledgement seem to accelerate forgetting? If the memories were attention-seeking behavior, acknowledgement should reinforce them. But the opposite happens. Once the child is heard, once the story is witnessed, the urgency fades, as if the memory was not seeking to be believed, but simply seeking to be released. The deeper questions that remain, whether reincarnation exists or not, these stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness, memory, and identity. If memory is produced by the brain, stored in neural tissue, dependent on synaptic connections, then it should not survive the death of the brain. But if some form of memory can persist beyond the body, then what we call consciousness is not merely a product of biology. It is something else, something that uses the brain rather than being created by it. And if that is true, then death is not an ending in the way we have been taught to understand it. It is a transition, a passage, a doorway between one form of existence and another. But these stories also suggest something else, something perhaps even more unsettling, that if consciousness does persist, it does not persist intact. Lou Gehrig did not come back as Christian Haupt in any complete sense. Christian is not Gehrig. He is his own person, with his own personality, his own life, his own future. What carried forward, if anything carried forward, was not a complete identity. It was fragments, emotional residue, behavioral echoes, a birthmark in the shape of a wound, enough to suggest continuity, not enough to prove it. And that ambiguity may be the point. Because if reincarnation were obvious, if past life memories persisted into adulthood fully intact, the implications would be staggering. Identity would fracture. Societies would struggle to function. Legal systems, inheritance, family structures, all would collapse under the weight of overlapping lives. But if the memories fade, if they surface only briefly in early childhood before the door closes, then the system remains functional. The child can grow up as themselves, free to become who they are meant to be in this life, without being haunted by who they were before. What the stories demand of us. These stories do not demand belief. They demand humility, because whether reincarnation exists or not, these children experience something real. Real fear, real longing, real recognition, real grief. Cameron's tears for Bara were real, even if we cannot explain them. Christian's obsession with baseball was real, even if we cannot account for its origin. Luke's knowledge of Pamela Robinson was real, even if we cannot verify the mechanism. And the adults around them had to decide what to do with that reality. Most chose to listen. And listening, in many cases, was enough. The stories were told, the memories were acknowledged, and then they faded. The children grew, life continued, the door closed, but something remains with us, the listeners, the witnesses, the ones who hear these stories and must decide what to make of them. Not certainty, but curiosity. Not proof, but possibility. We live in a culture that prefers beginnings and endings to be clean. Birth at one end, death at the other. A straight line between them. These stories suggest something messier, something cyclical, something unfinished. They suggest that consciousness, whatever it is, may not be as neatly contained as we assume. Or they may simply reveal how deeply human beings seek continuity and meaning, even in the most mysterious corners of existence. Either interpretation is uncomfortable, and that discomfort is the point. The question we must ask ourselves, because the question these stories leave us with is not about children. It is about us. What would it mean if identity were not singular? What would it mean if memory were not exclusively owned by the brain that seems to produce it? What would it mean if life were not a straight line, but a passage, a cycle, a journey that continues beyond the boundary we call death? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if these children forget, what might we have forgotten too? What if the reason we don't remember our own past lives, if they exist, is not because they didn't happen, but because we've moved past the age when such memories are accessible? What if the door that closes for these children around age 7 closed for us as well, so long ago that we cannot even remember it was ever open? What if the longing we sometimes feel for places we've never been, the inexplicable connection to strangers who feel like old friends, the phobias that have no source, the talents that seem to come from nowhere, what if those are the residue? Not memories, but echoes, fragments of something that came before, integrated so deeply into who we are now that we no longer recognize them as anything other than ourselves. We cannot know, but the stories ask us to wonder. The stories end here, but the questions do not. End of chapter 6. YouTube outro, 10 minutos. The following is written to be read aloud at a natural speaking pace, approximately 130 to 150 words per minute, totaling approximately 10 minutes of narration. And so, we reach the end of this journey. 6 chapters, 5 cases, thousands of documented stories, decades of research, and one question that refuses to be answered definitively. What are we to make of children who speak of lives they should not remember? If you've watched this entire series, you've encountered something rare in our modern world, a phenomenon that defies easy categorization. It is not quite science, though scientists have studied it rigorously for over 60 years. It is not quite religion, though many religious traditions accept it as doctrine. It is not quite psychology, though psychologists have attempted to explain it through developmental frameworks. It exists in the uncomfortable space between disciplines, between belief systems, between what we know and what we cannot yet explain. And perhaps that is exactly where it belongs, because the stories we've explored, Cameron and his island, Christian and his baseball legend, Luke and his remembered death, the Drews boy and his killer, the thousands of children documented by Ian Stevenson and Jim Tucker. These stories do not provide answers. They provide questions, and the questions matter more than we might think. Because in a world that has become increasingly certain about the boundaries of existence, what is real, what is possible, what survives, and what does not, these stories remind us that certainty may be premature, that the universe may be stranger than our current models allow, that consciousness, whatever it is, may not be as easily explained as neurons firing in tissue that will one day decay. Let me be clear about something. I am not here to convince you that reincarnation is real. I am not here to tell you that every case we've examined is genuine, or that skeptical explanations are invalid, or that you should change your fundamental beliefs about life, death, and what comes after. That is not my role. My role is simply to present what has been documented, to show you the patterns, to let you hear the voices of children who, for a brief window in their early lives, spoke as if they carried memories from before, and then to step back and let you decide what it means. Some of you will watch this series and conclude that these are fascinating examples of childhood imagination, vivid, consistent, emotionally compelling, but ultimately products of developing brains experimenting with identity and narrative. And you may be right. Some of you will watch this and see confirmation of what you already believed, that consciousness survives death, that souls reincarnate, that life is a cycle rather than a line. And you may be right. Some of you will watch this and remain exactly where you were when you started, uncertain, skeptical of definitive claims in either direction, but intrigued by the possibility that something remains unexplained. And you may be right. All of these positions are reasonable responses to the evidence we've seen, because the evidence, while compelling, is not conclusive. It cannot be. We have testimonial accounts, powerful, detailed, emotionally resonant, but ultimately subjective. We have verified facts, children knowing things they should not know, but always with the possibility, however remote, of information transfer through normal means. We have physical marks, birthmarks corresponding to wounds, but also millions of birthmarks that correspond to nothing at all. We have consistency across thousands of cases, but also the human tendency to find patterns, to seek meaning, to connect dots that may be unconnected. What we do not have is a mechanism. We do not know how memory could transfer from one body to another. We do not know what would carry it. We do not know where it would be stored between lives, and without mechanism, science cannot accept the phenomenon, no matter how many cases are documented. This is the fundamental impasse, and it may remain an impasse for a very long time. But here is what I want you to take away from this series. The impasse does not make the stories less important, because even if we cannot explain why these children speak the way they do, we can acknowledge that they speak. We can listen to their words. We can witness their distress, their longing, their grief, their confusion. We can see how their families respond, with love, with patience, with the willingness to take their children seriously, even when what they say seems impossible. And we can recognize that whether or not these memories come from past lives, they matter to the children who experience them. They feel real. They shape behavior, influence emotions, create bonds and conflicts that ripple through families. And when they are acknowledged, when the child is heard, when the story is witnessed, something shifts. The urgency fades. The obsession loosens. The child can move forward. That is not proof of reincarnation, but it is proof that listening matters, that witnessing matters, that taking a child seriously, even when what they say challenges everything we think we know about reality, can be healing in itself. And maybe that is the real lesson here. Not that we need to believe in reincarnation, but that we need to remain open to mystery, to acknowledge that there are things we do not yet understand, to resist the urge to dismiss experiences simply because they do not fit our current frameworks. Because the history of science is littered with phenomena that were once dismissed as impossible and later accepted as fact. Meteorites were once considered superstition. Rocks could not fall from the sky. Germs were once considered absurd, invisible creatures causing disease. Continental drift was once mocked. Continents could not move. And yet all of these are now accepted because the evidence eventually became undeniable and the mechanisms were discovered. We do not know if past life memories will follow the same trajectory. We do not know if a mechanism will ever be found, but we know that dismissing the phenomenon entirely, writing it off as imagination, fraud, or delusion, is premature. The patterns are too consistent. The cases are too numerous. The research is too rigorous. Something is happening. And until we understand what it is, humility is the only honest response. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with questions. Beautiful, uncomfortable, important questions. Questions about consciousness, about memory, about identity. Questions about what it means to be human. Questions about whether the boundary between life and death is as absolute as we have been taught, and questions about our own forgotten beginnings. Because if these children forget their past life memories around age 7, if the door closes and the memories dissolve into the background of who they become, then perhaps the same thing happened to us. Perhaps we, too, carried something forward when we were very young. Perhaps we, too, spoke of things we should not know. Perhaps our parents smiled and dismissed it, and we learned to stop talking about it, and the memories faded until they were no longer accessible. Not erased, just integrated so deeply that we no longer recognize them as coming from anywhere other than ourselves. This is speculation, but it is worth considering. Because if consciousness is more than brain activity, if it persists in some form beyond death, then the implications are staggering. It means we are more than we think we are. It means death is not the end we have been taught to fear. It means the relationships we build, the love we give, the growth we achieve, it all matters in ways that extend beyond a single lifetime. And it means that the work we do to become better, kinder, more conscious versions of ourselves may not be for this life alone. Again, this is not certainty, it is possibility. But possibility is enough to change how we live. If there is even a chance that consciousness continues, that growth matters across lifetimes, that we are part of something larger than the brief span between birth and death, then how we treat ourselves, how we treat others, how we engage with the world, it all takes on new significance. Not because we need to earn a better reincarnation, but because we are participating in something ongoing, something connected, something that does not begin with our birth or end with our death. The stories end here, but the questions do not. And I leave you with one final thought. These children, Cameron, Christian, Luke, the Drew's boy, the thousands documented by researchers, they spoke because they remembered something, or believed they remembered, or carried something forward that felt like memory, and then they forgot. The door closed, the memories faded, life continued. But we, the ones who hear their stories, we do not forget. We carry these cases with us. We wonder about them. We turn them over in our minds late at night when the world is quiet and the questions feel urgent. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the children speak, not so they will remember, but so we will remember. Not the specifics of their claimed past lives, but the larger truth they point toward. That consciousness is mysterious. That life is stranger than we know. That death may not be the end. And that the universe, vast, ancient, incomprehensible, may hold space for possibilities we have not yet imagined. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remaining open to mystery. And if you're a parent of a child who speaks of past lives, or if you yourself carry memories you cannot explain, know that you are not alone. The phenomenon is real, even if the explanation remains elusive. Your experience matters. Your story deserves to be heard. And the questions you carry are part of humanity's oldest inquiry. Who are we? Where do we come from? And where do we go when this life ends? May we all have the courage to wonder. May we all have the humility to admit what we do not know. And may we all remain open to the possibility that consciousness, that vast, mysterious thing that makes us who we are, is far more resilient, far more enduring, and far more extraordinary than we have dared to believe. Until next time, stay curious. Disclaimer: a note on sources and credibility. The cases presented in this series have been drawn from published research, documented investigations, and credible reporting. However, it is important to acknowledge the nature of the evidence and the limitations of what can be verified. Academically documented cases. The research of Dr. Ian Stevenson and Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies represents the most rigorous investigation of this phenomenon. Their work has been published in peer-reviewed journals and academic presses, and their methodology, while controversial, meets scientific standards for case documentation. The Cameron Macaulay case has been featured in television documentaries and journalistic investigations, with details verified by researchers and family members. Reported cases with limited documentation. Some cases, such as the Drew's boy in the Golan Heights, exist primarily in secondary sources, published accounts, books, and media reports, without the same level of independent verification as cases investigated directly by university researchers. For these cases, we have presented them as reported cases, acknowledging that while they are widely cited and internally consistent, they cannot be verified to the same standard as cases with extensive documentation. What we know versus what we don't know. We know that thousands of children worldwide spontaneously report past life memories. We know these reports follow consistent patterns across cultures. We know that many details have been verified by researchers. We know that the memories typically fade by age 6 to 7. We do not know whether these memories represent actual past lives. What mechanism could account for memory transfer between bodies? Why only some children report such memories? Whether alternative psychological explanations fully account for the phenomenon. Our commitment: this series is presented as an exploration, not as proof. We have attempted to represent the evidence fairly, acknowledge skeptical perspectives, and avoid making claims that cannot be supported. If any case we have presented contains factual errors or misrepresentations, we welcome correction. Our goal is not to convince you of any particular worldview, but to present a phenomenon that deserves serious attention, whatever its ultimate explanation may be. For those interested in learning more, we recommend Children Who Remember Previous Lives by Ian Stevenson, Life Before Life and Return to Life by Jim Tucker, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, med.virginia.edu/perceptual studies. Thank you for listening with an open and critical mind.